The warp does not dream. It is the dream. Every nightmare humanity has ever screamed into the dark made manifest. Every drop of hatred and ecstasy and despair given dimension and appetite. The great chaos gods float within it like continents of malice. Korn's brass citadel drowning in blood that never dries. Sinch's crystalline towers refracting futures into dust. Nurgle's garden rotting in perpetual contentment. Slaanish's courts vibrating at frequencies that dissolve sanity like acid through silk. Between them the demons churn, billions of screaming things born from mortal excess. Each one a concentrated wound in reality's fabric. The psychers of Cadia Secundus felt it before the instruments did. Sister Prognosticator, Evelyn of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica was mid-prayer when the vision took her. Not gently, not the way sanctioned visions arrived, with their smell of hot copper and orderly revelation, but like a fist through a cathedral window. She saw green, not the green of Nurgle's rot, not the poisoned emerald of corrupted worlds, something else, something that had no name in the warp's vocabulary, a color that burned without consuming, that raged without feeding anything. She bit through her own lip before the chamber's psychic dampeners could engage, and the last coherent thing she managed before the Medicae sedated her was not a word but a sound, a scream that went up instead of down. The rift opened at 0312 hours, Secundan Standard Time, 43 kilometers above Hive Massif Vortigern. During the third hour of the Coronate incursion, the Imperial commanders had been calling manageable. For 9 days, it was not managed. The void above Vortigern had been contested. Space, a fleet engagement between the Imperial Navy's Cadian Patrol Group and 3 Chaos cruisers running Coronate colors, hulls welded with screaming brass faces, their gun ports ringed with chains of skulls that clattered even in vacuum. Through some profane mechanism, the battle had been ugly. Close range, the kind of void combat, where boarding torpedoes traded before. Shields were fully stripped and both sides bled in corridors for hours. The Imperium was winning, technically, in the way that losing fewer ships than your enemy counts as winning. Then the rift opened between both fleets, and everything stopped. Rifts were not unusual above Cadia Secundus. The Eye of Terror was close enough that reality here wore thin as old parchment, and warp breaches of varying severity had been documented, catalogued, and ritually cleansed with enough frequency that the local ecclesiastical authorities had standardized the paperwork. But the Departamento Munitorum form for warp rift classification, severity grade 1 through 12, had never required the field marked nature of egress. It assumed the answer was always demon. Demon, demon, demon. What else came through a hole torn in the skin between realities? What came through this one did not register on the demon detection wards at all. The rift was the color Sister Evelyn had seen. That burning, consuming, furious green. Light that felt like pressure. Like the moment before a thunderstrike when every hair rises. And the air tastes of ozone and inevitability. It spread across 40 kilometers of void in under 2 seconds. And every psyker aboard every ship in the engagement, Imperial and Chaos alike, simultaneously lost consciousness. Astropaths slumped in their cradles. Shipbound navigators crashed against their sanctum walls, their warp eyes snapping shut in involuntary self-defense. The demons that had been clawing at the hull of the Chaos cruiser skull-crowned penitent simply stopped. Stopped clawing, stopped screaming their battle hymns, stopped being. Every bound demon in the system snuffed like candles in a gale. Later, when analysts would review the Auspex data, they would note something that none of them could explain in the formal report. In the 6.3 seconds between the rift's opening and the entity's emergence, every instrument measuring warp activity in the Cadia Secundus system flatlined. Not surged, not spiked, flatlined, as if the warp itself had flinched. He fell through the void trailing green fire. Not the controlled descent of a teleporting space marine. Not the dramatic blooming entrance of a greater demon. He fell, tumbling, enormous. His silhouette backlit by the closing rift so that the first images, captured by the fleets, pictures showed something that the Mechanicus analysts would later measure at just over 3 meters in standing height. Encased in what was not armor, was not a void suit. was not any shielding technology the Adeptus Mechanicus had in their taxonomies. The green light came from his hair, which defied void and physics and reason by moving as though submerged in something. Each strand a blade of light. From his eyes, which were not windows into a thinking mind but into something that thought in a register. Humanity had no instrument to measure. He hit the upper atmosphere of Cadia Secundus at a speed that should have incinerated him. It did not incinerate him. The shockwave, however, was measurable. It registered on every seismic station on the planet's surface as a magnitude 9 event that had no epicenter, no impact point, just a pressure wave radiating outward from the sky. In high Vortigern, stained glass windows depicting the God Emperor's triumph at Ullanor shattered simultaneously across 7 levels of the cathedral district. Servitors fell over. The cornate war drums that had been pounding without pause for 9 days went silent as the cultists beating them turned their heads skyward like dogs. Hearing an unfamiliar frequency, he crashed into the cornate siege line on the eastern approach to Vortigern's outer wall at 0314 hours and 22 seconds. The siege line ceased to exist at 0314 hours and 23 seconds. Not broken, not routed. The 40-meter stretch of entrenched chaos cultists, blood warriors in Baroque rust-red plate, and 2 Mauler fiends, demon engines of the blood god, their pistons driven by bound entities of pure rage, simply ceased to exist as organized matter. The crater was 80 meters wide and 11 meters deep, and the Imperial Guard troops on the wall above it, who had been dying by inches against that siege line for 4 days, stared down into the settling dust and could not find words adequate to the moment. What rose from the crater was not the enemy. It rose slowly, a shape that resolved from the dust cloud with something that functioned like deliberateness. Shoulders first, then a chest that suggested geological scale, then that face. Later the guardsmen would disagree about the face. Some said it was rage incarnate, a thing of pure destruction without thought. Others, those who had been looking directly at it, the ones who'd been closest, said something different. They said it looked lost, confused. The way a man looks when he wakes in a room he doesn't recognize and for a moment doesn't remember how he came to be there, or why, or what he was before. That moment lasted approximately 3 seconds. Then the remaining chaos forces on the eastern approach, because war drums or not, cornate warriors were not built for survival instinct. They were built for forward momentum. And the things that had erupted into their siege line was large, and it was there. Charged. 800 warriors of chaos. A full warband of the World Eater's successor cult. Threw themselves at the smoking crater with their chain axes screaming. The sound that followed was heard inside High Vortigern's inner sanctum. 12 kilometers away, through void-sealed ferrocrete walls 4 meters thick. It lasted 41 seconds. Then it stopped. The first coherent Vox transmission from the eastern wall went out at 0317 hours. Flagged extremist priority, a rating reserved for Titan sightings, Primarch-level threats, and warp incursions of Category 10 and above. It was routed simultaneously to the system's senior Astra Militarum command, the naval flagship Unbroken Covenant, and through the astropathic relay to the nearest Space Marine chapter keep, where it would reach the ears of a brother captain who had fought chaos, orcs, Tyranids, and 3 separate varieties of existential horror, and who would read the transcript of the transmission twice before acknowledging it. The transmission contained 3 sentences. Eastern approach is clear. All chaos forces neutralized. Something is standing in the crater, and it's looking at the wall, and I don't think we should open the gate. The guardsman who sent it was a 30-year veteran of the Cadian Secundant 7th, a woman who had held a trench line against a bloodthirster with a lost gun and a broken arm and had filed the after-action report without trembling. Her name was Sergeant Odessa Crowell, and she was not, by any professional or personal measure, easily frightened. Her hands were shaking when she sent it. In the crater below, the entity that had fallen from the rift stood, in the settling dust of 800 destroyed warriors, and looked at the enormous wall of the hive and felt, in the particular and untranslatable way that Broly experienced the world, that something was wrong with this place. The sky was wrong. The smell was wrong. Promethium and blood and something older. a psychic reek that pressed against his senses like weather. The stars, where he could see them through the smoke, were wrong. He had been with Chilai and Limo. He had been on Vampa. Something had happened. A light, a sound, a sensation like the universe folding, and now he was here, in the noise and the fire and the smell of things that had tried to hurt him. He had dealt with the things that tried to hurt him. That part, at least, was familiar. But the place was wrong. The people on the wall above him were not enemies. He could tell that much. He had learned enough of that distinction to hold it. But they were afraid of him. Everyone here was afraid of him. That, too, was familiar. He sat down in the center of the crater, crossed his legs, and waited. His green aura guttered like a sun finding its orbit, and the dust around him spiraled slowly outward in the absence of any wind. Above, through the burning sky, 900 light years away in a place called the Immaterium, something very old and very hungry turned its attention toward what it had just heard. Korn, the blood god, the skull taker, the lord of battles, sat upon his throne of 8 brass steps, above a sea of skulls that stretched beyond horizon in every direction, and listened to the echo of 41 seconds of slaughter that he had not sanctioned, from a creature that did not belong to him, and felt, for the first time in 10,000 years, something approaching curiosity. Blood had been shed. So much blood, but not one drop of it had reached his throne. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. Hope shines brightest in the darkest night. Brother Captain Cato Sicarius of the Ultramarines. Second Company had a reputation built on 2 foundations: absolute adherence to the Codex Astartes, and an ego large enough to have its own gravitational pull. His battle brothers said both things with equal parts admiration and exhaustion. He had held the Damnos line against Necron phasing fire with 6 Marines and a damaged Rhino. He had broken a Tyranid synapse node by walking into it. He had, on one memorable occasion, personally headbutt a Chaos Space Marine in Terminator plate and made it work. The Codex, he maintained, had an answer for every situation the galaxy could produce. He was reading the Auspex data on his flagship's Strategium display and discovering, for the first time in 22 years of service, that the Codex did not have a word for what he was looking at. The data was clean, no warp contamination on the readings, no demonic signature, no trace of chaos corruption, no Xenos biological marker matching any catalog species. The entity in the crater registered on thermal imaging as a heat source equivalent to a small plasma reactor. Its mass was consistent with a large human, perhaps slightly above Astartes scale. Its surface temperature should have been lethal to organic tissue. It was sitting cross-legged in a crater it had personally excavated, from 800 Chaos Warriors and radiating enough energy to make the atmospheric sensors around it weep interference. It was also, according to every demon detection instrument the Unbroken Covenant carried, utterly clean, no warp taint, no psychic corruption, no mark of any chaos god. Sicarius closed the data slate, clasped his hands behind his back, and made a decision with the serene confidence of a man who had never yet encountered a problem that charging at it more precisely hadn't improved. Prepare a Thunderhawk. Combat squad, full kit. I will assess the entity personally. Veteran Sergeant Gaius Praebian, who had served beside Sicarius long enough to have developed a finely calibrated sense of when his captain's confidence was going to get people hurt, cleared his throat. Captain, the Auspex readings suggest. The Auspex readings suggest it is not a demon, not a Xenos of known classification, and not Chaos-affiliated. Sicarius was already moving toward the armory bay, which means it is either a human, a mutant, or something entirely new. The Codex Astartes is clear on all 3 contingencies. We engage, we assess, and if necessary, we eliminate. What the Codex is less clear on, he added, almost to himself, his voice carrying the particular quality of a man filing a complaint with the universe, is something that destroys a coronate warband in 41 seconds without a weapon or a vehicle. He paused at the armory threshold. Bring the grav cannons. The Thunderhawk descended through Cadia Secundus's smoke-choked atmosphere in textbook formation. Low approach vector, minimal Auspex footprint, the kind of insertion the Codex prescribed. for unknown hostile contact, where the objective was assessment before engagement. Sicarius sat in the deployment bay with 5 of his finest, each one a decade of proven warfare encased in Mk.7 plate, and reviewed the footage from the wall-mounted Pictcasters that the Militarum had relayed. In the past 20 minutes, he watched the 41 seconds of Eastern Wall footage 4 times. The entity had not used a weapon. It had used itself, hands, body. What appeared to be concentrated bursts of the green energy it was generating. And it had done so, with a speed that the Pictcasters' frame rate struggled to capture. In several frames it was simply elsewhere, having crossed distances that should have required more time than physics allowed. In others it was standing, very still while things that hit it with enough force to crack ceramite simply did not appear to damage it. A Mauler fiend, a demon engine, a thing of iron and bound rage that could tear open a Lehman Russ tank. Like paper, had seized the entity around the torso and applied pressure that should have sheared through anything short of Terminator plate. The entity had looked at it, just looked, and then it had grabbed the Mauler fiend by what served as its jaw and had done something with it that Sicarius was going to have to invent vocabulary to describe in the after-action report. Threat assessment? He asked Praebian. Praebian had watched the same footage. He was quiet for a moment in the way that experienced warriors go quiet, not from lack of words, but from the careful selection of accurate ones. It's faster than us, he said finally. It hits harder than a dreadnought. It doesn't appear to take damage from anything the warband threw at it, including the Mauler fiends. And it stopped. He paused. After the warband was neutralized, it stopped. Sat down. Has not moved aggressively toward the hive. You're about to tell me the Codex doesn't account for a contact that annihilates chaos forces and then sits down. Politely, I was going to suggest we open with a communications attempt before the grav cannons. Sicarius looked at his veteran sergeant for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, with the precise economy of a man conceding a tactical point without surrendering any dignity. Noted, we open with hail. If there's no response, or if it engages, we go to maximum suppression immediately. The grav cannons are a last resort. A beat. A readily available last resort. The Thunderhawk set down 200 meters from the crater's edge, which placed it far enough for a combat withdrawal if necessary and close enough that the boarding ramps deployment was a statement of intent, rather than merely logistics. Sicarius descended first, because he was always first. The Codex was clear that a captain led from the front, and also because he was Cato Sicarius and the concept of letting someone else go first had never genuinely occurred to him. The heat was the first thing, even through his power armor's environmental seals. The warmth radiating from the crater's center was tangible, a pressure against the ceramite like standing near a plasma coil at low cycle. The green light was worse, not painful, not blinding, but deeply wrong in a way Sicarius's Genhance senses couldn't precisely categorize. His armor's spirit ward runes, etched by a chapter chaplain and blessed at the shrine of Macridge, flickered once and then went still, as if whatever they were designed to ward against simply wasn't present, which was accurate and somehow more unsettling than if they'd been screaming. He crested the crater's lip and looked down. The entity looked up. Sicarius had faced demon Primarchs. He had looked into the optical sensors of an awoken Necron Lord and held his ground. He had knelt before Gilliman himself and received a personal commendation, without losing his composure, which his battle brothers considered the most impressive feat of his career. He was not, by any reasonable measure, a man who staggered at the sight of things. He took one step back, not from fear. He would maintain this, sincerely, for the rest of his life. From recalibration, from the need to see the entity whole, because his first look at it as a complete visual impression rather than a collection of Auspex data points was not the same experience as the data had prepared him for. The data had said large human plasma reactor heat signature, unclassified energy output. What Sicarius saw at the bottom of the crater was something that suggested the concept of a human the way a mountain suggests a hill, recognizable category, completely different scale of implication. The green hair, the eyes, which were not quite the right color for anything that ought to be looking at you with that much attention. The way the light came from him not like a lamp, but like a banked fire. Something vast held it idle, a fraction of output. Around him, the crater floor was scorched in radial patterns that told a story of forces. Sicarius's armor's sensors couldn't fully quantify the skulls of things that had been warriors, or demon things wearing the shape of warriors, were half fused into the rock. For 6 seconds, a space marine, who had never in his adult life been at a loss for words, could not find any. What broke the silence was Praebian, via Helmvox, with the measured calm of a man who had processed his own surprise and filed it away as tactically irrelevant. Captain, it hasn't moved. I can see that, Sergeant. It's looking at you. I'm aware. It looks, Praebian paused. It looks like it's waiting for something. Sicarius descended into the crater. Not the combat drop, ceramite crashing. Dramatic entrance he was known for on the battlefield, a careful, deliberate walk down the crater's sloped interior, arms slightly away from his body in the universal biological grammar of I am not immediately attacking you. His gauntlet was nowhere. Near his gladius, the grav cannon team on the rim had targeting locks painted on the entity's center mass. Because Sicarius was bold but not suicidal, and the distinction between the two had kept him alive for 2 decades. He stopped 10 meters from the entity and engaged his Vox unit's external speakers at standard volume, running through the 63 known languages of the Imperium in auto-sequence. High Gothic, Low Gothic, Technolingua, Interrex pattern, Eldar Lexis. Tau VA standard, 12 dialects of Hive Cant, and got nothing. Not hostility, not incomprehension, just those eyes on him, patient and vast and carrying something behind them that Sicarius's combat instinct was trying to classify as a threat, and his deeper intuition was filing as something else. Grief, perhaps, or the aftermath of grief. The particular exhaustion of something that had been very angry for a very long time and had not yet remembered why. He tried the last option before the weapons. He raised one hand, palm outward, and held it. Broly looked at the blue giant standing in the crater below him, smaller than Broly. Everyone was smaller than Broly in this form, but larger than the normal creatures of this place by enough to suggest it was something different, something that had been built for War the Way. Broly himself had been built for something he still didn't fully understand. It wore blue like honor. It had come down into the crater instead of shooting from the edge, which the others on the wall had not done. It had its hand raised, open, waiting. Broly had learned this gesture. Chilai had taught him this gesture. With patience and repetition on cold Vampa with the wind cutting between the rocks. It meant she had shown him, demonstrating it herself first. I am here. I am not moving against you. He raised his own hand, palm outward, waiting. On the crater rim, veteran Sergeant Praebian exhaled, very slowly and quietly, updated his combat probability. Assessment from 90% chance of immediate hostile engagement to something significantly less certain. Beside him, the grav cannon operator kept the lock but did not fire. Below, the brother captain and the legendary Super Scion regarded each other across 10 meters of scorched Cadian rock, and the 41st millennium held its breath. In the Immaterium, distance is not a spatial concept. The warp does not have kilometers. It has intensity, proximity measured in psychic resonance, in emotional weight, in the gravitational pull of enough concentrated feeling to bend the fabric of unreality toward itself. The Eye of Terror is close to Cadia. Secundus not because of coordinates, but because enough hatred and worship and slaughter have been poured into that region of space over 10,000 years to make the membrane between real and unreal thin as a breath, held too long, which is why Korn felt every death in the Eastern approach. Crater the moment it happened. The blood god's domain was not a subtle place. It did not deal in nuance or metaphor. 8 brass steps rising from an ocean of skulls that stretched beyond any horizon the mortal mind could conceive, skulls of every species that had ever held a weapon, every creature that had ever died in anger, compressed into a landscape of calcified testament to violence's universality. Above the steps, the throne. Above the throne, the sky of the blood god's realm, not black, not red, but the precise color of the moment between a blade's arc and its landing. A color that existed only here because it had no equivalent in real space physics. Korn sat on his throne and collected. That was reduced to its essential function, what the blood god did. Every death in battle, every skull taken in rage, every life ended in violence anywhere in the galaxy. A fraction of that act's psychic resonance flowed to him, not consciously directed, not chosen. It simply came, the way heat rises, the way water descends. 10,000 years of the heresy's aftermath, of perpetual war across a million worlds, had made Khorne not merely powerful, but vast. A thing that had outgrown the concept of appetite and become the thing. Appetite was a metaphor for. He felt 41 seconds of slaughter above Cadia Secundus. Not unusual. Cadia Secundus bled for him constantly. A world so close to the eye that every battle there carried the resonance of proximity. Every death amplified by the thin membrane. He collected from it routinely, the way a river collects from tributaries without considering each individual drop. The 41 seconds registered. 800 warriors of his devoted, 2 of his bound demon engines, unmade at their cores. A warband of his beloved World Eater's successors, reduced to the material from which skulls are quarried. He extended his awareness toward the source, the collection point, the thing that had done this killing in his theater of war, above his devoted world, with such particular and total efficiency, and found nothing. Not nothing in the sense of absence, nothing in the sense of a shape that should have contained something and did not. He reached for the energy of the killings, the psychic taste of the entity that had done them, the resonance signature that any warp-touched or empiric being would carry automatically as a physical body, carries heat, and his awareness passed through the space where that signature should have been, the way a hand passes through smoke. The entity was there, demonstrably there. Khorne could perceive its physical existence through the material tether, could feel the deaths it had caused ringing in his collection like dropped coins. But its source, the well from which it drew, the psychic color every being in the galaxy carried without knowing it, chaos touched or not, faithful or heretic, space marine or cultist, every living thing trailed. Warp resonance, the way every physical object trails gravity, was absent. Khorne pulled his awareness back, sat with the absence for a duration that would have constituted geological time in the mortal world. The skulls below his throne did not speak. Skulls did not speak in Khorne's domain. Unlike the whispering trophies of Tsench or the murmuring garden things of Nurgle, because Khorne had no interest in what the dead had to say, only in the fact of their dying. But if they could have spoken, the skulls of the 800 World Eater's successors might have noted that the blood god's brass gauntlet, resting on the arm of his throne, had tightened, slowly, with the deliberateness of something that was not accustomed to the sensation it was processing, not rage. Khorne had no ratio for gradations of rage. He was rage, entirely and completely, the way fire is entirely and completely heat. What tightened his gauntlet was something rarer, something that belonged more naturally to Tsench's vocabulary, or to the cold calculus of the Necron dynasties, or to the patient hunger of hive fleet tendrils. Interest. Specific, focused, careful interest. The entity had killed 800 of his devoted, had unmade 2 of his demon engines, had done it in 41 seconds with no weapon, no ritual, no warp-drawn power, drawn nothing from the immaterium at all, fed nothing back. The deaths were his to collect. The killer was not. Khorne, whose philosophy of existence could be reduced to the equation that the skull of an unkillable thing was the greatest skull of all, decided that this required personal attention. He spoke one word into the warp, just one. The warp did not require more. When the blood god spoke, the immaterium convulsed around it. Scarbrand. Below, in the materium, the aftermath of the first contact was being carefully documented. Sicarius had spent 11 minutes in the crater communicating with the entity through gesture, expression, and the kind of patient repetitive demonstration that he had previously only encountered in primers, designed for new chapter serfs who arrived unable to read High Gothic. It was, he would later note in his report with characteristic understatement, not the most tactically dignified 11 minutes of my career, but it had produced results. The entity had not attacked, had responded, cautiously, to demonstrated non-hostility with demonstrated non-hostility in return, had watched Sicarius with those vast, strange eyes in a way that reminded him, uncomfortably, Privately, of the way a very young thing watches the world when it is trying to decide if the world is safe. He had established three things. First, the entity was not hostile by default. It had the capacity for restraint, which separated it categorically from demons, most orcs, and a significant portion of the galaxy's more immediate threats. Second, it did not understand anything he said. Not the content, not the intent as communicated through language. The Vox Unit's auto-translation protocols had cycled through every language in the Imperium's records plus 17. Xeno's tongues flagged as possibly extant and received no recognition response from the entity, beyond a slight tilt of its head at several of them, like a creature hearing a sound that almost resolves into meaning. Third, it was holding back. This was the one that Sicarius sat with, on the Thunderhawk back to the Unbroken Covenant, staring at the ceiling of the deployment bay while his battle brothers waited for him to debrief them. He had been close enough to the entity, 10 meters, close enough that his armor's sensors had given him detailed readings, and the energy output he'd measured at that proximity was not the energy output of something operating at full capacity. It was the energy output of something running at a fraction, a carefully maintained fraction, the way a man might lower his voice in a room where shouting would damage the walls. Broly, sitting in the crater as the blue armored creatures flying machine rose back into the smoke-choked sky, watched it go. Something was wrong with this place in a way that went beyond the strangeness of the landscape, the alien architecture of the enormous hive structure, the wrong smell of the air. There was something in the feeling of this world, a pressure that didn't come from outside, but from everywhere, a weight on his awareness that he had no language to name because he had never encountered anything like it. On his world, on Vampa, the universe had been cold and silent and full of things that wanted to eat him, and he had learned to find something like peace in that silence. This world had no silence. Even when the sound stopped, even here in the crater, with the fighting finished and the creatures on the wall still and the blue armored things flying machine is shrinking silhouette, the noise continued. A noise below noise, a pressure below air. A sound you heard in the part of you that wasn't ears. He didn't like it. He had learned, slowly and with difficulty, the difference between things he didn't like and things that needed to be destroyed. Sheila had taught him that, too. In her way, not with lessons or words, since his words were few and her patience was not infinite, but by example, by not destroying things she didn't like, by standing next to things she didn't like and breathing through it until it became familiar. He breathed. The green fire around him guttered lower, banked further. The kind of suppression that cost him nothing and communicated something to the creatures, watching from the wall that he couldn't name but somehow understood was important. He waited. 3 hours after Broly's arrival, the Vox network above, Cadia Secundus was conducting simultaneous conversations across 17 channels that all amounted to variations of the same argument. The Astra Militarum commanders wanted it contained. The naval admiral wanted it off-world before it attracted more chaos attention than the system could manage. The senior ecclesiarchy representative, a cardinal of significant age and negligible tactical sense, wanted it declared abominable intelligence and destroyed immediately on the grounds that anything that generated that much power without the God Emperor's obvious blessing was heretical by definition. Sicarius, composing his preliminary report aboard the Unbroken Covenant, rejected all three positions with the diplomatic phrasing of a man who had learned to code his certainty in the language of suggestion. The entity was not chaos-affiliated. Every instrument confirmed this. It was not psycho-derived. The warp readings around it were, if anything, suppressed in its presence. It was not mechanically constructed. The biological readings were unambiguous. It was a living thing of extraordinary power that had, on its first contact with the Imperium of mankind, destroyed a Khornate warband and then sat down. Destroying it, he wrote, would require resources we cannot currently quantify, in a system already engaged with a chaos incursion, and would eliminate a contact that has demonstrated non-hostility. Recommend continued assessment. Request inquisitorial consultation if entity's classification exceeds chapter authority, which I currently assess as probable. He paused over the final line. Added it anyway. Also recommend that whoever conducts the next assessment B. Authorized to offer something. It has been sitting alone in that crater for 3 hours. It came through a rift from somewhere that is not here, into a war zone, surrounded by things that want to either fight it or flee from it. Whatever it is patient. That patience is either our greatest asset or the last thing we will see. He transmitted the report and went to find Prabian, who he suspected had already started thinking about exactly this problem with more practical tools then. Strategic memos. Above the system, where the warp pressed, against the material universe, like an ocean against a dam of thought and prayer and desperate faith. Something vast and burning and ruinous heard. Korn summons and began to move toward the membrane. Skarbrand the Exiled One, the greatest bloodthirster, a greater demon that had once struck Korn himself in insane rage and been hurled across the warp cell. It had burned all rational thought from his existence, leaving only the purest possible distillation of the blood god's domain. Pure, undiluted, absolute rage, coming to meet something that did not know it was being hunted, sitting in a crater in the rain, waiting with the patience of someone who had learned patience the hardest way it can be learned, by having nothing else left. There is a philosophical school of thought, practiced by precisely 0 beings in the Warhammer 40,000 galaxy, because philosophy requires leisure and leisure requires surviving long enough to develop it, that holds violence to be the last resort of the intellectually exhausted. The orcs, if they were aware of this school of thought, would respond to it with the kind of full-body enthusiasm that involves a great deal of teeth and very little restraint, because the orcs had long ago resolved the question of violence's position in the hierarchy of options by removing all the other options entirely and declaring the hierarchy solved. Warboss Grimtusk Ironskull had not redirected his whack toward Cadia Secundus for strategic reasons. He had no strategic reasons. Strategy was a word that existed in the vocabulary of creatures who had to think about fighting, and Grimtusk had not had to think about fighting since the 3rd time he'd killed the previous warboss, which had happened early enough in his career that the thinking had been knocked out of him before it could establish permanent residence. He had redirected his whack because one of his weird boys, the twitchy, crackling, involuntarily, psychic shamans that the orc species produced as a side effect of their collective psychic field, creatures who spent most of their existence in the specific misery of receiving broadcasts they hadn't requested, had fallen off his fungus beer crate, started screaming in a register that shattered the nearest grot's goggles, and produced from his mouth, between the screaming, the following intelligence report. Dear something what killed 8. Undread over gets in 40 seconds and it wasn't US. Grimtusk had listened to this intelligence report, had processed it with the particular cognitive instrument that orc evolution had refined over millions of years into something that was not intelligence in the way humans used the word but was, in its own domain, ruthlessly effective, had come to the only conclusion available to a mind built the way his was built. Something had killed 800 things without him, without asking, without inviting him. 800. He had personally killed. He conducted an approximate mental inventory, definitely. More than 40 in one go, probably more than 80. Once, during the 3rd moon of the Piscina campaign, he was fairly sure he'd done over 100, though the records were unreliable because the nearby mechs had been too busy dying to take notes. 841 seconds was, by any orcish metric of respectability, a number that demanded a response. The response, because Grimtusk was an orc and there was only one response available, was immediate and total. He turned his entire fleet toward the energy signature the weird boy was screaming about and announced the change of course to his assembled knobs with one word that the entire ship heard through its vibrating hull plates. Whack! The knobs had cheered. The grots had fled. 3 mechs had started welding things together preemptively, because in their experience this was always about to become necessary. The weird boy had continued screaming until someone threw a helmet at him, at which point he stopped and looked profoundly relieved in the way of a man whose radio has finally been switched off. The whack of Grimtusk Ironskull, 47 warships of varying size, armament, and structural integrity, all of them painted red because Grimtusk had been told red ones went faster, and had absolutely no mechanism for questioning this information, turned toward Cadia Secundus with the purposeful chaos of a rock slide that had decided it had a destination. The first Orc transports broke atmosphere 6 hours after Broly's arrival, while the Imperial forces were still in the middle of arguing about what to do with him. This simplified the argument considerably. The Khornate incursion, which had been declared manageable for 9 days and had demonstrably not been managed, was still pressing against Vortigern's northern and western approaches. The eastern approach remained clear, because whatever had cleared it was still sitting in the crater, and both the remaining Chaos forces and the Imperial Guard on the wall had developed an unspoken bilateral agreement to leave the eastern approach alone. Now a third element descended from orbit in ships that appeared to have been constructed by welding other ships together with whatever metal was available, painted red, and launched with the confidence that the void was simply a larger version of the ground and could be traversed accordingly. The Orcs hit the Chaos lines first because the Chaos lines were between the landing zones and the crater, and the Orcs were constitutionally incapable of walking past a fight. The sound that erupted from the northern approach made the eastern crater's 41 seconds sound like a rehearsal. Khornate war drums started again, briefly, then the drums themselves were silenced as whatever had been beating them found something more immediate to do. For 22 minutes, the northern approach was a collision of two forces that both considered subtlety a manufacturing defect, and the Imperial Guard on the walls watched with the complicated, emotional experience of people witnessing something they would normally have to survive and currently did not. Then the Orcs won. They always won that kind of fight, not because they were stronger, not because they were smarter, but because they were enthusiastic in a way that Chaos warriors, for all their devotion, couldn't quite match. Chaos fought because the gods demanded it, or because the madness drove it, or because the promises of power sustained it. Orcs fought because fighting was the point, the destination, the entirety of the activity's value located in itself with no external justification required. Against that kind of commitment, even Khornate Berserk Fury eventually ran out of bodies. Grimtusk came down in the third wave, personally, because he had waited long enough. He stood 6 meters tall in his mega armor, a construction of plates, pistons, trophy skulls, and structural reinforcements that the mechs had been bolting onto him, incrementally for 15 years until the question of where the armor ended and Grimtusk began had become genuinely difficult to answer. His power claw could shear the hull of a Lehman Russ. His shoulda had been modified so many times that it now fired something the mechs called the custom mix and everyone else called a reason to stand further away. He had killed 2 Space Marine captains, a Tau Shasso in a battlesuit, and Eldar Autarch, something that might have been a Necron Lord or might have been very convincing terrain, and once an Aquila lander that had been trying to take off, which he didn't count officially but thought about fondly. He crested the debris field of the northern approach, stepped over what remained of the Chaos siege line, with the easy stride of something too large to need to navigate obstacles when it could simply compress them, and looked at the crater, looked at what was sitting in the crater. His remaining eye, the left one, the right having been replaced by a scope so extensively modified, it had become its own separate piece of equipment that happened to be attached to his face, narrowed. "That's him," he said, to no one in particular. Around him, his knobs had fanned out in the unspoken tactical formation that Orcs default to when their war boss is focused on something, which amounted to standing slightly behind him and looking ready. "That's to get what killed 8 undread boys." A long pause. The green fire in the crater below pulsed once, slowly, the way a sleeping thing breathes. "He's sitting down." Another pause. One of the knobs, a veteran of 14 campaigns, who had survived as long as he had by accurately reading his Warbus's emotional state, braced himself. "He's sitting down," Grimtusk roared, and the knobs braced because this was the volume that preceded either an assault or a declaration, and either required readiness. "What's he think he's doing sitting down? Dis is a fight. You don't sit down in a fight. That's disrespectful." He started walking toward the crater with the momentum of something geological. Broly heard it coming before he saw it. The ground vibrated in a way that suggested mass and purpose in roughly equal measure, and the sound that preceded the enormous green figure cresting the crater's rim was not language. Not in any sense he had encountered language, but it communicated with the clarity of pure physical fact. Something very large was very loud, and it was coming this way, and it was not afraid. He stood up. That was the most remarkable thing Grimtusk's knobs would discuss afterward. In the particular way orcs discuss things they find remarkable, which involved a lot of volume and reenactment. They had seen things stand up when Grimtusk approached. It happened occasionally. With Space Marines and Chaos Champions and the larger variety of Tyrannid bioform. Standing up was a reasonable response to the approach of 6 meters of Orc Warboss. But those things stood up with the body language of creatures, evaluating their options. The thing in the crater stood up with the body language of something that had been waiting for this specific development and found it, if not welcome exactly, then at least familiar. Two beings stood on opposite sides of the crater. One the product of millions of years of orc evolution, toward the singular conclusion that the answer to every question was hitting it harder. One the product of a scion genetic anomaly so extreme his own. People had tried to dispose of him at birth, refined by a childhood of isolation and survival into something that the universe around him could not quite categorize or contain. Grimtusk raised his power claw, not as a weapon, not yet, as a gesture. The orc version of the open palm Sicarius had offered, filtered through a culture where respect was demonstrated through the promise of effort rather than the suspension of it. A right den, he bellowed, across the 60 meters of crater between them, in a tone that managed to be simultaneously a challenge, an invitation, and a declaration of something approaching joy. Let's see what you got, you green little squig. Broly looked at the enormous green thing across the crater, looked at the raised claw, looked at the expression on the face. Above it, an expression that is limited but growing vocabulary of facial communication translated, slowly and with some uncertainty, as something that was not hatred, and not fear, and not the cold assessment of the blue armored things. Something that wanted to meet him, not to destroy him, to meet him, in the only language it had. The green fire around Broly rose, not the banked, careful fraction he'd been maintaining. Higher. The temperature in the crater climbed 40 degrees in under a second. The rock beneath his feet began to glow at the edges of his footprints, and the smoke above the crater twisted in the thermal column his aura generated. And for the first time since he'd fallen through the rift, something in Broly's chest unlocked a half-turn, the part of him that understood the world through force and response, and the clear grammar of bodies testing each other. He crossed the crater in a single movement that the orcs watching from the rim would describe forever afterward, with the reverent and precision of those who have witnessed something their instruments couldn't capture. He was there, and then he was somewhere else. And the somewhere else was directly in front of Grimtusk, and the distance between them was close enough that the green fire of Broly's aura met the crackling power field of Grimtusk's mega armor, and the air between them smelled of ozone and heated metal and something older and stranger than either. Grimtusk looked up, actually up, for the first time in years, at something that was not as tall as him in raw measurement but occupied more space than its dimensions suggested, in the way of things that are very large in categories that height doesn't capture. He grinned with every tooth he had. "Dear it is," he said, almost quietly for him, almost tenderly. "That's the look." He swung. Broly caught the power claw. The shockwave leveled every standing structure within 40 meters, opened a new crater inside the existing crater, and registered on the seismic stations across the hive's foundation as a spike that the analysts initially classified as a secondary impact event, before realizing there had been no secondary impact, just two things hitting each other with the full conviction of their respective natures. On the wall above, the Imperial Guard sergeant who had sent the original extremists Vox transmission watched the dust cloud rise from the eastern approach, where an orc warboss had just punched something that had destroyed 800 Chaos Warriors, and the something had caught it, and neither of them had gone down. She filed a second extremist transmission. It contained 4 words. Send the Inquisitor. Now, Inquisitor Lord Cassia Valdris of the Ordo Malleus had authorized exterminatus 7 times in her career. She did not consider this a large number. She did not consider it a small number. She considered it a precise number, exactly as many times as the calculus of necessity had produced that answer when she fed it the correct variables. And she had long ago made peace with the fact that the calculus did not care how the answer felt. The Inquisition existed because someone had to do the arithmetic that ordinary human decency couldn't perform, and Valdris had spent 40 years demonstrating a particular aptitude for it. She arrived in system aboard the Black-hulled rapid strike vessel, Throne's Patience 18 hours after Sergeant Crowell's second transmission, accompanied by her retinue of 7 specialists and the particular gravitational field of authority that inquisitorial rosettes generated. In military environments, the way conversations stopped, the way colonels found reasons to be elsewhere, the way even Space Marine captains arranged their postures slightly differently when one walked into the room. Sicarius, to his credit, met her at the docking bay rather than waiting to be summoned. She appreciated efficiency. She also appreciated that he had brought actual data rather than opinions, which distinguished him from approximately 60% of the military commanders she encountered in crisis situations. She reviewed his reports during the transit to the command strategium, standing because she had found over 40 years that sitting invited the particular kind of comfortable thinking that produced bad decisions. The Auspex data, the Pickcaster footage, his written assessment, the weird boy translated intelligence from the orc engagement, obtained through a mechanicus, linguist who specialized in orc speak with the specific misery of someone who had chosen a skill set they would always be needed for and never thanked for. His preliminary conclusion. She reached the final line. It is patient. That patience is either our greatest asset or the last thing we will see. And looked up at him. You went into the crater. Assessed it was necessary. The Codex Astartes recommends personal assessment of unclassified contacts above a certain threat threshold. Sicarius had the expression of a man who had been waiting for this question and had prepared a response. The Codex recommends decisive action to gather intelligence when existing data is insufficient. I assessed that the existing data was insufficient. You went into the crater because you wanted to look at it. A pause, precise as a scalpel. Yes. Valdris permitted herself something that was not quite a smile. Good. So did I. She set the data slate down. Where is it now? The answer to where it was now was complicated by the fact that it had moved. Not fled. The Auspex was clear on that. Not attacked. It had simply, at some point during the 7th hour of its presence in the eastern crater, stood up and walked through the debris field of the Chaos siege line it had destroyed, through the outer perimeter of the orc encampment that had established itself around the crater with the proprietary enthusiasm of orcs who had witnessed something they considered theirs by right of proximity, past the orc sentries who had not stopped it, partly because orc sentries were not built for the subtlety that stopping a moving thing without fighting it required, and partly because Grimtusk had left standing orders that the green of her thing was not to be interfered with because Grimtusk intended to fight it again once his claw was repaired, and nobody was going to deprive him of that by accidentally starting the fight early. It had walked to the outer wall of High Vortigern, had stood before the ferrocrete face of it, 4 meters thick, 30 meters high, studded with gun emplacements and watchtowers and the architectural grammar of a civilization that had been building walls against the dark for 10,000 years, and had placed one hand flat against it. The wall, by every sensor reading available, had not been damaged. The hand had rested there for 6 hours. The guard troops in the watchtower directly above the contact point had filed 18 reports about this, ranging from tactically urgent to existentially confused, before their commanding officer had instructed them to stop filing reports and simply watch. Valdris stood at the wall's base and looked up at the hand. It was, she noted, not pressing, not testing for weakness, not the exploratory touch of something, evaluating structural integrity for eventual breach. The thermal imaging showed the contact point was warm, skin temperature, pressed flat, the way a person presses their hand against something not to push it, but to feel it. The way someone might put their hand on a door they're deciding whether to open, or a window they're deciding whether to look through. It's curious, said her savant Yendris, a small man with augmetic eyes who had spent 30 years studying Xenos, behavioral patterns, and still managed to be surprised by them on a regular basis. He was consulting a data slate with the urgency of someone whose professional framework was actively failing him. The behavioral indicators, non-aggression, investigation of environment, response to gesture rather than language, they're consistent, with an entity that is attempting to understand its surroundings rather than dominate them, which is inconsistent with the energy output readings. Things that output that much power don't generally, he gestured helplessly. They don't generally touch walls. Things that output that much power, Valdris said, generally don't sit in craters for 6 hours either, or let orc war bosses punch them to establish social dynamics. The orc engagement is fascinating actually. It is. Save it. She took 3 steps forward, to the edge of the cleared zone that the guard had established, around the entity's position, a 50-meter radius of empty ground that felt less like a security perimeter and more like a social consensus, an unspoken agreement that this was the entity's space and entering it required deliberation. She stopped at the edge. Broly had known she was there before she reached the perimeter. He had known the blue armored thing was there before it reached the crater's rim, had known the enormous green thing was coming before it, crested the debris field. This place was wrong and strange and full of a pressure he couldn't name. But bodies moving with purpose generated a signature that his senses, refined on Vampa, were not noticing things. Approaching meant not surviving the approach, read without effort. This new one was small, smaller than the blue armored things, smaller than the enormous green thing, smaller than most of the creatures he'd seen on the wall above. But it moved like the blue armored things moved, not the green thing's forward momentum, which was pure and simple and communicative in its simplicity, but a different quality, deliberate, contained, the movement of something that had decided exactly how far to come and was comfortable at the distance it had chosen. He removed his hand from the wall, turned. Valdris looked at him directly, without the intermediary of data slates or Pictcaster footage for the first time, and the experience of looking at him directly was, she found, quite different from the experience of reviewing footage of him. The footage had conveyed scale and power and the particular devastation of his engagement with the Chaos Warband. It had not conveyed. She searched for the precise word and found it. Somewhat to her surprise, personality. The quality of a thinking thing behind the vast, strange eyes. The particular way he held himself when he was not fighting, which was not the coiled readiness of a weapon at rest, but something more complicated. Something that had learned to hold itself carefully because it had not always known how to. She held up her hand, palm outward. He looked at her hand. Then, with the faint quality of recognition, something remembered rather than instinctive, a learned response locating its trigger, he raised his own. Valdris kept her palm up and with her other hand, slowly, reached into the case that Yendris had been carrying and withdrew a ration block. Standard Astra Militarum issue, wrapped in the dun-colored packaging that had not changed significantly in 3,000 years because it didn't need to. The contents were nutritionally adequate and culinarily bleak, and that was exactly what the Munitorum required of them. She held it out, not toward him. She didn't cross the perimeter. She simply held it out in his direction, and then set it on the ground at the perimeter's edge, took 3 steps back. Broly looked at the thing on the ground, looked at the small creature that had put it there, looked at the distance the small creature had moved back after putting it there, and what that distance communicated in the grammar of bodies and space, that he was better at reading than any spoken language. He crossed the perimeter slowly, picked up the ration block, looked at it for a long moment, with the focused attention of someone who has learned that new things in new places require examination before they can be understood. Then he ate it, packaging and all, because the distinction between packaging and contents was not immediately obvious, and he was, below everything else, someone who had grown up on Vampa eating things without the luxury of selectivity. Yendris made a small, strangled sound that was not distress, but was adjacent to it. That's, the packaging is plasteel reinforced, it's not. Note it, Valdris said. Don't comment on it. She spent 4 hours at the perimeter. Not talking, she had established within the first 20 minutes that talking produced no comprehension, only the same slight head tilt that Sicarius had noted in his report. She communicated instead through the most primitive interface available to a species that had colonized the galaxy: presence, patience, and the gradual accumulation of small gestures that built not understanding but the possibility of understanding. She sat when he sat. She stood when he stood. She did not bring weapons near the perimeter, and when two of her stormtroopers attempted to flank the position on standard protective protocol, she voxed them back with a sharpness in her voice that they would discuss quietly for weeks afterward. This was the part that mattered, not the exterminatus calculation that had been made and set aside within the first 30 minutes of reviewing Sicarius's data, because the exterminatus calculation required confidence that the weapon would work, and Valdris was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that she had no such confidence. A thing that had absorbed a Malarfine's crushing force and a Warbus's power claw and the full output of a cornate warband, and had treated all three as manageable inconveniences, was not a thing you sterilized a planet to kill, because sterilizing the planet might not kill it, and then you had a sterilized planet and a surviving entity, which was strictly worse than the starting position. But that was the tactical calculation. The other calculation, the one that sat in a different part of her mind, the part that 40 years of facing the warp and its appetites had developed into something almost precognitive, was producing a different concern. This thing had no warp signature. None. In a universe where the warp was the substrate of all psychic and magical existence, where every living thing trailed its emotional resonance into the immaterium the way a ship trailed exhaust and void, where the chaos gods grew fat on the ambient output of 10 billion souls feeling things, this entity was absent, not protected, not shielded, not blank in the way of untouchables, whose absence was its own distinctive signature, simply not present in the warp as a category. Valdris had read every Ordo Malleus report on anomalous warp phenomena in her career. She had the clearance for the sealed archives. She had read things in those archives that had required sedation afterward. She had never read anything that described this. "What does Cinch do?" she said quietly to Yendris. At the end of the 4th hour, not taking her eyes off the figure sitting cross-legged 40 meters away with the green fire around him banked to something almost gentle. When something exists that he cannot see, Yendris was quiet for a moment. He understood the question. He had access to the same archives she did. "Nothing in the records describes the scenario," he said carefully. "I know. I'm asking what you think." Another pause. Longer. Cinch deals in futures, in the threads of possibility and manipulation. Every plan the changer of ways makes depends on being able to see the variables. He looked at the figure in the distance. Something he can't see is a variable he can't account for. Which means Cinch doesn't ignore it. Valdris stood, brushing dust from her coat. Cinch eliminates it, or tries to make it legible, to bring it into the framework where he can see it again. She looked at the sky, the smoke-choked, warp-tainted, eternally embattled sky of Cadia Secundus, with the expression of someone doing arithmetic that she already knows the answer to and doesn't yet know what to do with. We have time before chaos sends a second ground force. Less time before they send something else. She voxed Sicarius. "Brother Captain, I need your fastest courier ship prepared for immediate dispatch to Macrich." A pause on the vox. "You're contacting the Lord Commander." "I'm contacting the Lord Commander." She looked at the entity one more time. At the patience of it. At the green fire that burned without consuming. That raged without feeding anything the warp could touch. "Because I've just realized what the second worst option is. And the second worst option is killing it." She turned away from the perimeter toward the command post. "The worst option is letting chaos have it first. And chaos has had longer than we have to think about how. In the crystalline towers of the impossible fortress, where futures refracted into fragments, and the great conspirators sat at the center of a web of causality so intricate that its outermost threads had not yet been causes when the universe began. Cinch, who saw all things, who knew all threads, who had mapped the entirety of mortal possibility, with the patient genius of a being for whom Time was less a river than a medium. He swam through at will, looked at the place in his web where the new variable should have been, and found a hole, not an absence, an insult, a shape in the web where a thread should run and did not, could not, because the thing at its center generated no future he could read, cast no shadow and possibility, existed in his perception the way a blind spot exists in vision. Not darkness, but the absence of seeing, the place the eye cannot go, the changer of ways examined. This hole for a duration that translated to approximately 11 seconds in real space and represented more concentrated focus than Sench had applied to any single variable in 600 years. Then he began to plan. The rubric Marines arrived at midnight. Not the crashing, brass-bellowing midnight of cornate assault. No war drums. No chain-axe chorus. No parademons darkening the sky in advance formations. They came the way Tsench's chosen always came. Sideways. Through angles that geometry didn't sanction. Through the space between one moment and the next where the changer of ways had quietly rearranged the furniture of causality and left a door where none had been. One moment, the northern perimeter sensors showed clear. The next moment, there were 37 of them standing inside the sensor radius, equidistant from each other, with the geometric precision of a summoning circle that had been built over time, rather than space. And the blue-gold flame of Tsienshin sorcery was already burning at the tip of every staff they carried. The rubric Marines were the tragedy at the heart of Tsench's Thousand Sons Legion, warriors so thoroughly corrupted by their own pursuit of forbidden knowledge that their primarch is desperate. Ritual had reduced them to dust inside their own armor, animated only by the sorcerous bindings their surviving sorcerer brothers maintained. They were not alive in any sense that metabolized oxygen or harbored ambition. They were the armor and the memory of the men inside it and the will of the sorcerer who held their leash, walking in the shape of warriors. Because the shape of warriors was useful and they had no preference anymore. Leading them was Erathon the twice renamed, a sorcerer of the Thousand Sons who had been studying the new variable in Sench's web for 11 hours with the methodical hunger of a scholar encountering a primary source that contradicted everything he thought he knew. He wore the blue and gold of his legion in the ancient style, before the heresy, before the rubric, before the 10,000 years of exile in the planet of sorcerers had weathered everything about the Thousand Sons except their ambition and their frustration. His staff was topped with the Eye of Tsench, a physical artifact of his patron's gaze, and it was through this staff that he had read the absence in the web and drawn from it the conclusions that had shaped tonight's operation. The entity could not be seen by Tsench. This was either the most dangerous thing in the galaxy or the most valuable, depending entirely on who controlled it. Erathon intended to determine which, and then arrange for the latter. The rubric Marines moved to encircle the perimeter in silence. Not stealth, something more fundamental than stealth. An absence of acoustic event that sorcery produced. By simply removing the air's permission to carry sound from their movements, the guard sentries on the outer approaches did not hear them. The motion trackers, however, the simple, dumb, sorcery-resistant motion trackers that Valdris had insisted on installing at every approach angle, because she had been fighting chaos long enough to know that warding against psychers was insufficient. If you forgot to ward against the physical, registered 37 heat signatures, moving in geometric formation, and screamed at every board in the command post simultaneously. Valdris was already moving before the alarm finished sounding. She was fast for a baseline human, augmetic leg replacements, stim injectors in her coat's lining, 40 years of operational urgency encoded into her reflexes as a motor habit, and she was out of the command post and running the perimeter, calculation in her head simultaneously. 37 contacts, geometric formation around the entity's position, Tsienshin sorcery signature on every one of them. The detectors were screaming that, too, the warp readings, spiking into categories that the instruments labeled in colors, rather than numbers, because the numbers had run out. She had 4 stormtroopers on immediate readiness. Sicarius had a combat squad at the wall staging point 8 minutes away at full sprint for a space marine. And the Orc encampment was already awake. Because of course it was. Orcs slept lightly, if at all, and the concept of a perimeter being breached, without them being involved, was one they found personally offensive on grounds that transcended tactical logic. She could hear Grimtusk's voice from across the camp, conducting what amounted to a staff briefing, at a volume that was rendering the staff briefing unnecessary, given that everyone within 2 kilometers could now hear it. None of this was going to matter if Arathon reached the entity before she did. She reached the perimeter first, barely. And what she found when she got there stopped her for exactly the 3 seconds she could afford to stop. The Rubric Marines had completed their encirclement. They stood at the perimeter's edge, 37 suits of ancient, empty armor burning with cold Cientian fire, their bolters raised in unified targeting posture, their staves alight, forming a perfect circle around the entity's position. Arathon stood at the circle's focal point, staff extended, and the air, between his staff and Broly, was doing something that Valdris had no instrument to measure, because it was happening in a register between the physical and the psychic, in the borderland space where Cientian sorcery did its most precise work. Not attacking, probing, thin threads of witchfire reaching out toward the figure in the circle's center with the delicate, testing patience of a physician conducting an examination, looking for a thread to pull, a resonance to exploit, a frequency to match that would create the opening that binding spells required. Broly stood in the center and watched the threads come. He could feel them, not with the senses he used, to feel bodies approaching through vibration and air pressure, with something else, something that had no name in his vocabulary because, on his world, there had been no occasion for it to develop one. The sense that registered the particular feeling of this place's wrongness, pressing against him from a new direction. The threads were part of the wrongness. They came from the burning-eyed, armored figures and from the robed thing at the center, and they reached toward him with the quality of hands, feeling for a doorknob in the dark, not hostile exactly, in the way a surgeon's scalpel is not hostile, but absolutely committed to what it was doing, regardless of the patient's preference. They reached him, made contact with the edge of his aura, and stopped. Arathon had expected resistance. He had calibrated for resistance, had prepared binding algorithms of sufficient complexity to hold a greater demon, woven etheric hooks that could latch onto any psychic signature of any frequency, prepared contingencies for entities that fought back, that fled, that tried to overwhelm his circle's containment. He had not prepared for nothing. The threads reached the aura's edge and found not a wall, not a counterforce, not a different psychic signature pushing back. Found the same absence that Cinch had found in the web, a surface the sorcery couldn't grip because the sorcery worked by finding the warp resonance in a target and using it as a handhold. And there was no warp resonance, nothing to grip. The thread slid off the edge of his aura the way water slides off sealed metal. And Arathon felt his prepared bindings simply fail, not broken but rendered inapplicable, the way a key fails not because the lock is stronger but because it is the wrong shape of lock entirely. He recalibrated in under 2 seconds, because he was a Thousand Suns sorcerer and recalibration was the foundational skill of his tradition. Adjusted the threads to seek not psychic signature, but emotional resonance, cruder, less elegant. The technique you used on non-psychers and baseline humans and things that had no warp presence to speak of, working through the ambient emotional field rather than the focused, channeled power. Every living thing felt things. Every living thing's feelings created a micro-resonance in the immaterium. Even humans who had never shown a psychic gift in their lives. He would work through that, use the entity's emotions as a lever. Cinch's sorcery could work through grief and rage and confusion as readily as through raw psychic power, perhaps more readily, in a target that was demonstrably overflowing with all three. The threads reached for emotional resonance. Found it. Mountains of it. Grief pressed down so deep it had fossilized into something that was almost geological. Rage so layered and complicated it had its own internal geography. Confusion about this place and this situation. That was fresh and raw and pressurized. The threads sank into this like roots into soil, and Arathon began. Carefully, precisely, the way a locksmith, who has finally identified the correct mechanism, begins to turn, to apply the binding. The green fire went from bank to sun, not gradually, not as a response to the binding attempt that he could have tracked and adjusted for. Instantaneously, the threshold crossed and the suppression released in the same moment, as if whatever Broly used to hold himself in check had encountered something that fell below the threshold of problems to be held in check and had moved directly to the simpler category of things to be removed. The temperature in the circle spiked by 80 degrees in under a second. The rubric marines, ancient armor, ceramite that had survived 10,000 years and a dozen campaigns, blessed and warded and reinforced by sorcery at every generation of maintenance, began to glow at the edges, the sorcerous threads, connecting them to Erathon's circle lit up like wires in an overloaded circuit, flaring white where they passed through Broly's aura. And Erathon felt the feedback hit him through his staff, like grabbing a live power cable. He was thrown 20 meters, hit the ground rolling, the way 10,000 years of war had encoded into muscle. Memory that survived even the most violently interrupted concentration. Came up on one knee with his staff, raised and found that the circle was already compromised. 14 of the rubric marines had been flung outward by the aura's expansion, their ancient forms hitting the Cadian rock with sounds that combined the particular registers of heavy armor, impacting stone and something more fundamental than that, something that suggested the bindings holding them animated were under pressure they hadn't been designed to sustain. Broly stood in the space where the circle had been and looked at the robed thing that had sent the feeling hands into him. He did not like the feeling hands. He had encountered many things he did not like since arriving in this place, and he had developed, slowly and with difficulty, the practice of not immediately resolving his dislike through destruction. This practice was not instinctive. It was learned, maintained with effort, a habit built by someone who had wanted to know him well enough to spend time teaching him that the gap between dislike and destruction mattered. But the feeling hands had gone into the deep places, the places he did not have words for but recognized by their weight. Paragus, cold and dark and the ship falling. Chilai's voice small through the distance, of the thing he was fighting being too large to stop. And that was different. That was not this place trying to hurt him. That was something reaching, deliberately, into what was oldest and most wrong in him and pulling, with calculated purpose, like pulling a pin. Erathon rose to his feet and made the fastest calculation of his millennium-long career. The binding had failed. The direct emotional probe had failed catastrophically. The circle was broken. He had 11 rubric marines still in formation and 26 scattered across 100 meters of terrain in varying states of damaged animation. And the entity was looking at him with those eyes that contained nothing his sorcery could read and everything his instinct recognized as terminal danger. Sinch's first directive, when the plan fails, survive to make the next plan. He spoke a word in the language of the warp and folded space around himself and his 11 remaining functional marines, and they stepped sideways out of the materium with the particular geometric impossibility of Tsienshin. Retreat, not fleeing, technically, because the Thousand Suns did not flee. Withdrawing, tactically, to reassess variables that had proven more complex than initial analysis suggested. The remaining 26 rubric marines, the ones whose animating bindings had been disrupted by the aura expansion, stood empty in the aftermath, their armor cooling, the fire in their eye lenses guttering and going dark. The dust of the men they'd been settling slowly in the Cadian wind. Valdris arrived at the perimeter's edge 40 seconds after the retreat to find 26 empty suits of Thousand Suns armor, standing in a rough circle around a figure wreathed in green fire that was only now, slowly, beginning to bank again. The fire came down in stages, first from sun to furnace, then from furnace to forge, then from forge to the carefully maintained fraction he'd been running since the beginning. He looked at her. She looked at the empty armor, at the scorch marks in the rock, at what the energy readings on her instruments were telling her about. The peak output registered in the last 90 seconds, which the instruments were reporting, in a notation that suggested they had needed to invent new notation for the purpose. Did they hurt you? She asked, in low Gothic, knowing he didn't understand the words. He looked at her for a moment. Then he shook his head. Once, a gesture she was fairly sure he'd learned from watching her retinue use it in the past 4 hours, meaning either no or I have learned this gesture means something and am attempting to deploy it correctly. Good, she said. Then, in the clinical register of someone updating a threat assessment in real time. Cinch knows you're here. He sent a probing force. The probe failed. She looked at the empty armor again. He'll send something with more resources next time. He always does. She voxed Sicarius without looking away from the figure with the fading green fire. Brother Captain, has the courier to Mackridge departed? 20 minutes ago. Contact them. Update the priority level. She paused. Tell them the changer of ways has personally taken an interest. That changes the timeline considerably. A longer pause on the vox. Even Sicarius, who had absorbed most of the evening's events with the equanimity of a man who had decided to simply update his understanding of possible rather than argue with evidence, took a moment with that one. Understood, he said finally. Do we have an estimate on Gilliman's response time? Valdris looked at the warp-tainted sky, at the eye bleeding, its colors at the horizon's edge, at the stars that burned wrong in a universe that had been at war with itself for 10,000 years, at the smoke of 3 separate battles still rising from Cadia Secundus's contested surface, felt the weight of the arithmetic she was conducting in the part of her mind that did not stop working, regardless of what the rest of her was doing. Thought about Cinch's hole in the web, and Korn's uncollected skulls, and 26 empty suits of rubric marine armor standing in a circle around, something that neither god of chaos had been able to touch. Tell them to hurry, she said. Somewhere in the planet of sorcerers, Arathon the twice-renamed knelt before a reflection that was not his own and reported his failure in the precise, unsentimental language of a scholar annotating a negative result. The reflection listened. The reflection had 9 heads that were not heads, and 1,000 eyes that were not eyes, and it existed in a state of perpetual transformation that made describing it the way you would describe a fixed object technically inaccurate. It was pleased, not with the failure. Cinch was never pleased with failure in itself, but with what the failure had confirmed. The emotional probe had found the resonance before the aura's response, had burned the threads away, found the grief, layered and geological, found the rage, vast as weather, found something else beneath both of those, something Arathon had only touched for a fraction of a second, before the feedback severed the connection, something quiet and small, and carefully maintained, the way a person keeps something fragile alive in conditions that should have killed it long ago, something that the entity was protecting, something that could, with the right leverage applied at the right moment, become the crack in the wall. Cinch began adjusting his threads. The plan had not failed. The plan had gathered data. There was the changer of ways understood in the intricate, crystalline, inhuman way that he understood everything. A difference. He began to plan around the quiet thing. Terra, not the Terra of history, not the blue-green world that ancient humanity had looked up at from primitive dwellings and called home, not the garden planet of legend that existed now only in illuminated manuscripts kept behind void-sealed glass in the deepest vaults of the administratum, read by scholars who would never see the sky they described. Terra of the 41st millennium was a world that had been consumed by its own civilization, layered over with 10,000 years of construction until the original surface existed only as archaeological theory in the deepest sublevels, where even the sump-rats grew. Strange. A world of 40 billion souls packed into hive structures that made Cadia Secundus's Vortigern look provincial. A world wrapped in orbital defenses, so dense that the light from its star arrived on the surface pre-filtered by the shadows of weapons platforms. At its center, in the place that had once been a mountain range and was now the Imperial Palace, largest structure in human history, a continent-spanning monument to the desperate persistence of a species that refused to accept its own fragility, was the Sanctum Imperialis, and at the sanctum's heart, in a chamber that no living human had entered in 600 years, because the act of entering it required passing through 47 separate mechanisms of protection that collectively constituted a filter separating the merely devout from the genuinely necessary, sat the golden throne, And on the throne sat what remained of the God Emperor of mankind. What remained was not a corpse, because a corpse was a thing that had stopped. What remained was not alive, because alive implied a relationship with biological process that had ceased to be relevant 10 millennia ago. What remained was, the Mechanicus had 17 technical terms for it, all of them inadequate, all of them used anyway because inadequate. Vocabulary was better than. Acknowledged silence, a psychic presence of incalculable magnitude, maintained by the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers, feeding the Astronomicon that let humanity navigate the warp, holding shut the doors in reality that would otherwise open and swallow everything. A god's mind in a dead man's body, doing the most important thing in human history by the margin of a will so vast that 10,000 years of biological deterioration hadn't been sufficient to extinguish it. The emperor did not sleep. Sleep was a biological function. What the emperor did was closer, perhaps, to the way a star burns, not with intention in the conscious sense, not with a mind that processed thoughts sequentially and came to conclusions through deliberation, with a constant, massive, undiscriminating output that was simply what he was now, the fullest expression of what 10,000 years on the throne had made him. The Astronomicon burned. The warp doors stayed shut. The 10,000 psychers died each day in their deaths, fed the fire, and the fire burned. And that was everything, and had been everything. And the concept of anything else had become as remote as the concept of individual. Raindrops is to an ocean. Occasionally, something reached through. Not often. The scale of his output made the kind of focused, directional attention that noticing individual things required enormously costly. The way asking a star to illuminate one specific room is a request that misunderstands the nature of what stars do. But occasionally, a sufficiently massive psychic event, a sufficiently profound disturbance in the warp's fabric, a sufficiently wrong thing happening in the material universe. Sometimes these registered, not as thoughts, more as the way extreme cold registers even through armor, not processed, just present, just there in a way that could not be entirely ignored. The warp disturbance above, Cadia Secundus had registered 47 minutes after Broly's arrival, when the initial flat line of warp activity had propagated through the immaterium toward Terra at the speed of psychic event rather than light, which was faster and stranger and not measurable in conventional units. It had registered as absence, the same absence that Cinch found in his web, that Korn found in his collection, that Valdris's instruments found in their readings. A void in the warp's constant, chaotic, overwhelming signal. A silence in the noise. The Emperor's attention, not directed, not chosen. The closest analogy was the way an immune system responds to something it doesn't recognize. Automatic and non-deliberate, moved toward the silence. And stopped. In the chamber of the Astronomicon, where the choir of 1,000 psychers sat in their cradles and burned their lives as fuel for humanity's navigational light. The senior choir master felt it as a tremor in the ambient psychic field, not a disturbance exactly, more like the moment before a disturbance, the hell-breath quality of a vast attention briefly redirecting. She had served in this chamber for 30 years. She had felt the Emperor's awareness move before, twice in 3 decades, each time leaving her with the specific experience of standing too close to something whose scale was not compatible with the scale of human perception. She recognized what she was feeling now. She gripped her cradle's armrest and waited. The awareness reached the absence above Cadia Secundus, touched the edge of what was there, not the warp signature, because there was no warp signature to touch, but the physical presence, the key that radiated from Broly in the material universe's heat and light and force, and that pressure which his opponents felt as weather. The awareness of the God Emperor of mankind, 10,000 years refined, psychically vast beyond any instrument's capacity to measure, touched the edge of Broly's key output and found something it recognized. Not the specific thing, not Broly himself, not science, not Dragon Ball's cosmology or its physics or its particular taxonomy of power. None of that was legible, but beneath the specific thing, at the level below taxonomy and classification, at the level where the universe wrote its most fundamental statements in a language that predated every civilization that had ever tried to name it. At that level, the Emperor's awareness found something that resonated with, something it had not touched in 10,000 years. A power that did not come from the warp, did not feed the warp, did not draw from the sea of emotion and suffering and psychic excess that the warp was made of. A power that came from somewhere else entirely, from something that predated the warp's current form, that belonged to the universe's physical substrate in a way that the warp, for all its immensity, did not. Something as old as matter, as old as the force that held matter together and the force that pushed it apart, fundamental in a way that made the warp's 10,000-year dominance of human history look like weather on the surface of a very deep ocean. The choir master felt the tremor peak and hold, not for a second, not for the brief flash of a redirected attention she'd experienced before, but for a duration she would later calculate as 9 seconds, which was an eternity by the metrics of what happened in this chamber. 9 seconds of the Emperor's awareness, fully engaged, touching something above Cadia Secundus. Then it withdrew, not with the quality of a threat assessed and dismissed, not with the quality of something recognized and approved, with the quality, and she would struggle with this in her report, using 6 different phrasings before settling on one that was accurate without being so accurate it got her detained by the inquisition of something that had found an answer to a question it had not known it was still asking. Something surprised, if surprise was a state, accessible to a consciousness 10,000 years removed from ordinary cognition, something that had reached toward an absence in the warp and found, where it expected nothing, something that reminded it of before. Before the warp was the warp, before the chaos gods were the chaos gods, before 10,000 years of human suffering had fed those entities into the monstrous, galaxy-devouring permanence they now occupied, something from before that, from a universe where power grew from will and training and the living body's capacity for effort, rather than from the harvested emotional excess of billions of beings who had never been asked to donate. The awareness withdrew. The choir master exhaled. In the Sanctum Imperialis, in the chamber no living human had entered in 600 years, the Golden Throne's mechanisms registered a fractional fluctuation in output, less than 1%, lasting 9 seconds, completely unprecedented in the monitoring records going back 400 years. The senior Mechanicus Muggos responsible for throne monitoring noticed it instantly, flagged it with a trembling mechadendrite, and then spent 11 minutes constructing a justification for why it was a sensor error before abandoning the justification because his own augmented cognition would not let him file something he knew was false. He filed a report marked at the highest clearance level available to him. Then he prayed, which was unusual for a Muggos and which he did not include in the report. Above Cadia Secundus, Broly felt something. Not the feeling hands of the robed sorcerer, not intrusive, not probing, not reaching into the deep places with calculated purpose. Something else. A warmth that was not heat, a presence that was not pressure, an attention that registered not as threat or probe, but as recognition. Perhaps, or the closest the sensation could map to a word he had for things. Like being seen from very far away by something that had not expected to see you. Like the moment of eye contact across a distance large enough that the contact itself is the message, before any translation of intent. It lasted 9 seconds. Then it was gone, and Broly was alone with the wrong-feeling sky and the burning horizon and the distant sounds of the enormous green things camp and the small watching creatures beyond the perimeter, and the absence of whatever had just noticed him was, in its own way, as large as the presence had been. He sat with it. He was learning to sit with things that he didn't understand, here in this wrong place. Because the alternative to sitting with them was destroying them, and he was trying to maintain the practice of not doing that. But the warmth had been, it had been like Chilai's voice through static, like something almost familiar translated, through enough distance and strangeness, that you couldn't quite name it, but your body knew it before your mind did. He put his hand against his own chest, over the place where the warmth had been for 9 seconds. Held it there. Robot Gilliman, pre-march of the Ultramarines, Lord Commander of the Imperium, Regent of Terra, received Sicarius's updated report and Valdris's priority revision, simultaneously aboard the Macrage Honor. While reviewing The logistics documentation for the Indomitus Crusades. 43rd Wave deployment. He was doing 3 other things simultaneously because he was a pre-march and sequential. Cognition was a constraint he had been engineered past before humanity had a word for the engineering involved. He read the report. Then he read it again, because the first reading had produced conclusions that warranted verification. Not because he doubted his own cognition. He didn't. Not as a general rule. The Primarch's mind was not built for self-doubt in that register. But because the conclusions were sufficiently significant that the discipline of confirmation felt warranted. Entity of unclassified power. No warp signature. No chaos affiliation. No Xenos classification match. Coordinate warband destroyed in 41 seconds. Orc. Warboss engaged and survived the engagement, showing interest rather than hostility. Rubric Marine binding attempt failed catastrophically. Cinch operationally engaged. The Emperor's awareness. He stopped at that part. Read the Choirmaster's report that Valdris had included as an attachment. The one filed at highest clearance that had somehow reached inquisitorial channels within 4 hours because Valdris had friends in places that were not officially supposed to exist. 9 seconds. He closed the documents, looked at the viewport, at the void and the distant stars, and the 1,000-yard distance that a Primarch's eyes could focus to without mechanical assistance. Thought about the arithmetic of the situation with the particular quality of mind that had written the Codex Astartes, administered an empire, and wept before the Golden Throne at what 10,000 years had reduced his father to. Something existed above Cadia, Secundus that the warp could not touch and that his father had. For 9 seconds, noticed. That Korn could not collect from and Cinch could not read and that had, by all behavioral evidence, the capacity for restraint. It was actively exercising in a war zone, while surrounded by things that were afraid of it. Adjust course, he said to the flag bridge. Cadia Secundus. Maximum transit speed. His equerry, a tetrarch of Ultramar who had served him since the Indomitus Crusades beginning and had long since recalibrated his definition of extraordinary to account for the consistent company he kept, looked up. The 43rd Wave Logistics Review. We'll wait. Gilliman picked up his stylus and began composing a preliminary assessment. In the margin of the report, in the precise, dense shorthand he used when he was thinking faster than formal prose accommodated. Logistics can be managed remotely. This cannot. He paused over the margin, added 3 words that the equerry, reading over his shoulder, would think about for the rest of his career. Father was surprised. The night above Cadia Secundus deepened. If night was a meaningful concept, on a world where the eye of terror painted the horizon, with its own color at every hour. The chaos incursion had stalled without the eastern approach available and with the Orc Wyak occupying the northern front, which was not the tactical situation Imperial Command had planned for but was functionally preferable to the previous situation of losing ground on 3 fronts. Simultaneously, in the eastern crater, Broly sat. He had found, in the hours since the warmth that was gone, a particular quality of stillness. That was not patience in the way that waiting is patience, not the suppression of a desire to act, not the discipline of restraint over impulse. Something closer to the stillness that Vampa had taught him. The kind you learn when the environment offers nothing and the only thing moving is you and everything. That makes noise draws attention from things with teeth. A stillness that was not empty but full of the sounds of this place. The smell of it, the specific quality of wrongness that he was slowly, without the vocabulary to name what he was doing. Learning, mapping, the way a body learns a new gravity by finding where its weight falls. The pressure, that noise below noise. The wrongness of the warp pressing against the world's skin was constant, but he was finding its frequency, learning the difference between its ambient presence and its directional surges. The way you learn the difference between wind as background and wind as announcement. The probing threads of the sorcerer had come from one direction in that frequency. The warmth that was gone had come from a direction that didn't correspond to a physical direction at all. He could not have articulated any of this. He had no words for it, and the process was not verbal, but in the part of him that had survived Vampa's absolute conditions. and the isolation of a childhood spent with nothing but the planet and his own body and the increasingly refined understanding of what his body could do. In that part, something was cataloging, learning the rules of a universe that had never expected to contain him. Above him, something vast moved in the warp with the sound of brass wings and the smell of blood that had never dried, drawn by Korn's single spoken word, crossing the membrane between immaterium and materium with the contempt for physical law that greater demons carried like a birthright. Skarbrand the Exiled One had no capacity for strategy, no capacity for patience, no capacity for any cognitive function that existed in the territory between perception and violence. Every thought his ruined mind could still form began and ended with the same imperative that Korn's throw across. The warp had burned into him as the only remaining content of his existence. Rage, pure, complete, the only distillation remaining after everything else had been incinerated. He entered real space 40 kilometers above Cadia Secundus's surface and fell toward the green light below with his twin axes already swinging. The warp alarms across the entire system went off simultaneously, not the specific, targeted shriek of a probing sorcerer, but the full catastrophic bellow of every ward and detector and sanctified instrument screaming in unified recognition of a greater demon of the first magnitude, entering reality with no ritual, preparation, and no containment. In the command post, Valdris looked at the readings, at the magnitude, at the specific entity, classification the wards were, reporting now that it was fully materialized. Skarbrand, she said. Not a question, not a curse, though it occupied that register. Just naming the arithmetic correctly. She voxed every Imperial asset in the system simultaneously. All forces. Defensive posture. Do not engage. A pause. 1 second. 2. The third second she used for the full weight of the calculation she was performing. The variables she was feeding into the calculus that had authorized exterminatus 7 times and was now producing a different answer. Let it reach the entity. Do not interfere. Sicarius's voice came back immediately with the controlled urgency of a man who respected authority and found it currently insufficient. Inquisitor, Skarbrand is a greater demon of Korn. If it reaches the civilian population of, it's not going to the civilian population, Valdris said. She was watching the descent track on her display. The vector, the absolute, undeviating straight line of a thing that had no capacity for deception or misdirection, that went toward the strongest signal of rage and blood and raw, violent energy in its vicinity the way iron goes toward a magnet. It's going to the crater. She watched the vector. Hold. Unwavering. True. Skarbrand can find the most powerful being in any system by following the blood echo of their violence. Korn sent him here to claim something. The descent track. Touch the craters. Position on the display perfectly. He sent him to the right address. In the crater, the pressure changed. Broly looked up. Skarbrand hit the crater at terminal velocity, and the crater became a different crater. The original, 80 meters wide, 11 deep, carved by Broly's arrival through a coordinate siege line, ceased to be the relevant geography. What replaced it was 300 meters of radius and 30 meters of depth, the kind of excavation that siege engineers with the right equipment could have managed in 6 weeks, accomplished in the instant of a greater demon's landing by the displacement of matter that didn't want to be where it was, but had no vote in the matter. The shockwave leveled the Orc encampment's outer structures, rolled through the Imperial Guard's wall positions hard enough to knock people from their feet, and registered on the seismic network as an impact event that briefly convinced 3 separate monitoring stations that something had fallen from orbit. Something had, technically, just not the kind of something their instruments had taxonomy for. Skarbrand rose from the new crater's center. The word greater demon was a classification, a taxonomic convenience that the Imperium used to distinguish entities of Korn's direct attention from the lesser demons, the bloodletters and flesh hounds and juggernauts that comprised his armies. The classification was accurate in the way that calling a supernova a star-related event was accurate, technically true and functionally inadequate. Scarbrand stood 6 meters of absolute corruption, wings of shredded brass membrane, the ruins of what had been, the most beautiful of Khorne's servants. Before the exiled one's insane blow against his own, Master had earned him a throw across the warp so violent it had burned everything away except the rage. His face was barely a face anymore. The twin axes, slaughter and carnage, weapons that had drunk from the blood of gods, were already moving, already seeking, already doing the only thing Scarbrand was still capable of deciding to do. He turned toward the green light. Broly was already standing. What happened in the next 4 minutes was observed by every living thing with eyes above. Cadia Secundus's Eastern approach, and would be discussed, argued about, mythologized, recorded, and inadequately described for as long as any of the observers lived, which, for the Imperial Guard troops on the wall, was long enough, and for the orcs who watched from the rubble of their camp with an expression that their species used to indicate the highest category of respect available to them, was also long enough, and for Valdris, watching on Auspex from the command post with every instrument she had, pushed to maximum sensitivity, was the rest of her career spent writing a report about it and revising the report and revising it again because no version captured what the instruments had actually recorded. Slaughter came down first, a horizontal arc that covered the full width of the crater in a single swing, the kind of blow that Gilliman's battle records contained 3 documented instances of, each time made against entities that had subsequently not existed. The axe's edge carrying Khorne's will in physical form, not just sharpened metal but the concentrated intent of the blood god's desire made manifest in the material universe. Broly stepped inside the arc, not away from it. Inside, beneath the axe's path, moving with the reading of incoming force that came, not from seeing, but from the part of him that had spent a lifetime with nothing to read, but the bodies of things trying to kill him. The axe passed over him close enough that the cornate energy it radiated scorched the air above his head, and then he was inside Scarbrand's guard with both hands on the greater demon's axe arm, and he pulled, using the demon's own momentum, with a judo efficiency that should not have been possible at this scale, this mass, this velocity, and Scarbrand, greatest of the bloodthirsters, Khorne's most exiled and most terrible servant, went into the crater wall at a speed that turned the ferrocrete hard Cadian rock into a pressure wave of particulate matter spreading outward at subsonic speeds. The wall caught it. The greater demon was already extracting itself from the wall before the dust of impact had finished traveling. That was the first 6 seconds. For the next 3 minutes and 54 seconds, Cadia Secundus hosted the kind of event that the Immaterium registered as a psychic detonation, not because either participant was drawing from the warp, but because the physical violence of their exchange was operating at a scale where the boundary between physical event and psychic event became a matter of perspective rather than fact. Every blow Scarbrand landed, and some landed, because Scarbrand was a greater demon of Khorne, and the notion that anything could simply not be hit by him was a notion that required testing. At the actual scale of the entity's output, every blow registered on Broly's body with visible effect, not damage in the way the Chaos Warband's weapons had produced no visible effect. Actual effect. The ground around Broly's feet cracked and compressed under the energy transfer of impacts absorbed. Twice he was driven into the crater floor hard, enough to leave impressions of his silhouette in the rock. Once carnage clipped his shoulder, and the energy discharge knocked him laterally 30 meters before he corrected in midair and came back. He came back faster each time. This was the thing that Valdris's instruments captured and that the Auspex data would later confirm in measurements she had not initially believed. With each exchange, Broly's output climbed. Not dramatically, not in the sudden escalation of someone drawing on reserves. Incrementally, the way a fire climbs when you add fuel steadily rather than all at once. Each impact absorbed, each blow traded, each second of sustained engagement against something that could actually engage him at his current output. The ceiling rose. The green light intensified by measurable degrees. The temperature in the crater climbed. The seismic readings shifted from impact event to something the monitoring station's instruments categorized under a classification that translated from Mechanicus notation as sustained energetic phenomenon. Source unclear. Skarbrand felt none of this. Skarbrand was incapable of feeling anything that didn't translate directly into more rage. But even the mindless, burning, absolute fury that constituted his entire remaining cognition had an instinct at its bottom, the deepest animal layer, beneath even the demon nature, the thing that Khorne had thrown him across, the warp so hard that it had survived even that, and that instinct, sometime around the third minute of the exchange, began producing a signal that Skarbrand had not experienced in 10,000 years. The signal was not fear. Skarbrand did not fear. The signal was the demon equivalent of structural warning, the sense a wall develops when the load it bears exceeds its construction parameters. Not awareness, not comprehension, just the basic fact of a system operating outside its designed envelope. He swung both axes simultaneously. Broly caught both, not at the handles, at the axe heads, one in each hand, the cornate energy of slaughter and carnage discharging across his palms in detonations that the walls pickcasters captured as two simultaneous flares of light that briefly overwrote the footage entirely, leaving 2 seconds of white. When the footage resolved, Broly was holding both axes. Skarbrand was straining against the grip. The ground between them was gone, vaporized, excavated by the force of the contest, leaving them suspended over a void in the crater floor that glowed at its edges. The green light was not banked anymore. Robot Guilliman arrived in system 4 minutes after Skarbrand's landing, because the Macridge's honor had made a transit that its navigator would describe in her log as technically inadvisable but structurally survivable, and that Guilliman had authorized, with the specific authority of a man who had written the books on inadvisable transits and knew which ones the structure could survive. He received the battle data in real time as his Overlord-class flagship decelerated into orbital position, the Auspex readings, the pickcaster footage, the seismic reports, Valdris's running commentary on the Vox and the clipped, precise register of someone narrating events she was also evaluating simultaneously. He processed all of it through a cognition that the Emperor had designed for exactly this kind of multivariable, high-stakes, unprecedented assessment, and he processed it standing at the viewport of his command deck watching the glow. From the eastern approach visible, even from orbit, a green light pulsing with the rhythm of something that was not a fire but moved like one. Tactical assessment, he said. His equerry had learned not to offer tactical assessments when Guilliman asked for them, because the Primarchus assessments were always superior, and the request was not actually a request for input. It was the verbal equivalent of a man thinking aloud. He waited. Skarbrand's presence serves Khorne's interest if the engagement results in the entity's death or insufficient rage output to establish a warp claim. Guilliman said, watching the glow pulse. It does not serve Khorne's interest if the engagement simply makes the entity stronger, which is what the output data suggests is occurring. He turned from the viewport. Give me a Thunderhawk. Personal insertion. Full honor guard. The equerry processed this. Processed the part where the Lord, commander of the Imperium was proposing to personally descend into a combat zone where a greater demon of Khorne was currently engaged with something the Emperor himself had noticed, filed the processing under not my authority to question, and began the arrangements. Sicarius's voice arrived on the bridge Vox immediately, because Sicarius had been monitoring the Macridge's honors communications. The moment it translated in system, Lord Commander, the tactical situation on the ground is. I've reviewed the data. Brother Captain. Guilliman was already moving toward the Thunderhawk Bay. Your preliminary report was thorough. The assessment that this contact requires something other than weapons was correct. A pause. The length of a pre-march deciding how precisely to articulate something. I'm bringing something other than weapons. The Inquisitor Lord has been managing the contact for 18 hours and has achieved measurable progress. I've read her reports. She's established non-hostility, basic gestural communication, and the entity's willingness to exercise restraint. Guilliman's pace through the corridor was not quite a run. Primarchs did not run in their own ships unless the ship was on fire, and sometimes not even then. But it covered ground. with the efficiency of a body engineered for exactly this purpose. But Skarbrand is currently in direct engagement. And what the data is showing is that the engagement is increasing the entity's output, not because it's losing, because it's winning, and winning against something that can actually challenge it is, functionally, feeding it. He paused at the Thunderhawk Bay's threshold. We need to end the engagement before the output ceiling reaches a level that makes the concept of nearby structures theoretical. The honor guard was assembled, 10 Victrix, guard in the gold plate of the Primarch's personal protection detail, each one a veteran of the Indomitus Crusade selected for the specific quality of following Gilliman into situations that would have been described as suicidal if the person entering them had been anyone else. They fell into formation with the practiced silence of people who had accepted their job description fully. Gilliman looked at them. This insertion is non-combat, he said. You are present as witness, not as force. Your weapons stay holstered, unless a specific threat is directed at me that the entity is not already addressing. We are going into a battle between a greater demon and something that is winning that battle. And our objective is to end the battle, not to participate in it. Does everyone understand the distinction? 10 veterans of the Indomitus Crusade understood the distinction. Several of them had opinions about it that they maintained at the professional level of not the Lord Commander's concern. Good, Gilliman said. Let's go. Skarbrand was losing. Not in terms of damage, greater. Demons of Khorne did not sustain damage in the biological sense. Their form maintained by warp substance rather than flesh. And destroying them in the material universe returned them to the immaterium rather than ending them. But in terms of the exchange, in terms of what each blow traded accomplished, Skarbrand was losing in the way that something loses when its maximum output has been found in the thing it is. Fighting has not yet found its ceiling. The green fire above the crater was visible from the hive's upper spires, 12 kilometers away, through void-sealed ferrocrete walls. The residents of Hive Vortigans, upper levels were reporting their windows, glowing green. The orcs had stopped their defensive rebuilding entirely and were watching from the camp's ruins with the mass concentration that orcs reserved for things too magnificent to look away from, and Grimtusk, standing at their front on his repaired claw, had said nothing. For 4 minutes, an unprecedented silence that his knobs would recount with reverence. The Thunderhawk came in low and fast and set down at the crater's rim, exactly as Broly, moving faster than the pickcasters could cleanly capture, got both hands under Skarbrand's collarbone and threw him through the greatest bloodthirster, the exiled one, threw him the way you throw something when you have found the grip, and the angle and the leverage, and you apply everything, not a fraction, not a careful portion, not the deliberately maintained restraint of someone, practicing not destroying the things around them. Everything. The green fire went white at its core for 1 second and Skarbrand left the crater's airspace at a velocity that the Navy Auspex, tracking the event from orbit, classified initially as debris from an explosion before the object's size resolved, and the classification became a category that required a supervisor's authorization to file. He came down 11 kilometers away on the western approach, directly into the Chaos Siege line, which ceased to press against the hive's western wall for reasons that would take the Imperial Guard 20 minutes to understand and would substantially alter the incursion's strategic situation in ways the Munitorum would be documenting for months. In the crater, the green fire came down slowly, stages, the same stages as before, but in reverse, descending from white through the colors of diminishing output back toward the banked fraction he maintained in stillness. It took longer than previous descents. The ceiling that had been found was higher than before, and the distance back to the floor was greater. And for a moment, Valdris's instruments reported output levels that she was going to have to explain to people with classification clearances she had never previously needed to communicate with. Then it was down, banked. The careful, deliberate fraction. The Thunderhawk was opening its ramp. Gilliman descended into the crater alone, not with the honor guard. He had left them at the rim with the instruction he'd given on the ship, their hands away from their weapons, their presence as witness. He descended alone because everything in Valdris's report, everything in Sicarius's data, everything the behavioral evidence had, accumulated over 18 hours pointed to the same conclusion. This entity read approach through the language of bodies and space and the grammar of what position communicated before words could. Descending alone said something that descending with 10 armed warriors could not say. He was 2.5 meters of pre-march. His armor was the blue of ultramar. His face the face of a man who had been engineered to lead and had spent 10,000 years in a warp capsule, missing the chance, and had woken to find the Imperium in the state he'd left it and had chosen, against all rational justification, to try anyway. He had the Primarch's eyes, not superhuman in appearance, but in the quality of attention behind them, the depth of processing visible in the way they moved. He had read every report. He had reviewed every data point. He had thought about this moment for the 4 hours of transit and arrived at what he believed was the correct approach. He stopped 10 meters from Broly and did not raise his hand. He sat down on the crater floor in the scorch marks and the rock impressions and the debris of a 4-minute engagement with a greater demon, Robot Gilliman, Lord Commander of the Imperium of Mankind, sat down cross-legged on the ground. Broly looked at him. The pre-march was larger than the blue armored things, larger than the small one who had brought food, not as large as the enormous green thing, but large in a different way, the way the enormous green thing was large in categories, beyond height, occupying more space than its dimensions suggested. This large thing did that also. It had come down from the flying machine alone, left the others at the edge, and it had sat down. Sat down, the way Broly sat, the position he had found in the crater on the first day when the fighting was finished and there was nothing to do but wait, and he hadn't known what else to do. He sat down facing it. Gilliman looked at the figure across 10 meters of scorched Cadian rock and felt, beneath the Primarch's cognition and the Lord Commander's strategic calculus, and the 10,000 years of Imperium's grief, he carried as a birthright something simpler, something that the reports had hinted at and the direct encounter confirmed, in a way that instruments couldn't quite capture. This was not a weapon, not a threat, not primarily. Everything that could threaten was also capable of choosing not to, and what sat across from him had been choosing not to for 18 hours in a war zone while surrounded by things that feared and tested, and probed and fought it, and it had been making that choice continuously, which was harder than making it once. He reached into his armor storage and found what he'd brought. Not a weapon, not a tactical instrument. During the transit, he had asked his equerry for the simplest, most universal thing he could think of, something that crossed species and language and context, something that required no translation, because it didn't use language. In the first place, his equerry, who was a practical man, had brought him a piece of fruit from the flagship's hydroponics. An orange, specifically, ordinary and round, and the color of nothing important. Gilliman set it on the ground between them, not thrown, placed, deliberately, at the midpoint of the 10 meters. Broly looked at the orange, looked at the large thing that had placed it, looked back at the orange. Across the crater rim, Valdris watched on a feed from a Pictorcast drone she deployed the moment the Thunderhawk landed, and she understood what she was seeing in the same moment she understood she was going to have difficulty explaining it in any report that needed to make sense to people who hadn't been here. The Lord Commander of the Imperium and something that had come through. A warp rift from a place that had no taxonomy in Imperial records were sitting across from each other in a damaged crater on a contested hive world, and between them was a piece of fruit, and nobody was dead. Broly reached out and picked up the orange, turned it in his hand, examined it with the focused attention he gave to new things. Then, with the same careful deliberateness, he produced from somewhere, from nothing visible, from the place where Science apparently stored things they were keeping, the crumpled remains of the ration block packaging that Valdris had given him 4 hours ago, set it on the ground at the midpoint. An exchange, something offered for something received. Gilliman looked at the packaging. Something moved in his face, not amusement exactly, not the full human expression, but the Primarch's equivalent, the thing that lived in that register. He picked up the packaging, looked at it, looked at Broly. He tapped his own chest, held the eye contact. said his name clearly, once. Gilliman. Broly looked at him, at the hand on the chest, at the sound that had accompanied it. He had learned this gesture too. Chi-Lai, again, early on Vampa, with the patience of someone who had understood that the work of communication began at the foundation. Or not at all. He tapped his own chest, said his name, the word in his own language, the only language he had, the only thing in this wrong place that still sounded like something from before the rift. Broly. Gilliman said it back. The pronunciation imperfect. The Primarch is linguistic cognition working with the phonemes available. But close enough that Broly's chin lifted very slightly in the way of someone who has heard their name in an unfamiliar mouth and found it recognizable. On the crater rim, Grimtusk, Iron Skull watched a Primarch and a legendary Super Saiyan exchange names over a piece of fruit and packaging, and experienced something that orc neurology was not designed to process and, therefore, routed through the nearest available framework, which was respect. Deep, uncomplicated, structural respect. The kind you had for something that was more fight than you expected, and more complicated than you wanted, and better than you feared. He's all right, Grimtusk said, to nobody in particular. Nobody argued with him. Korn did not manifest in real space often. The distinction between often and ever was, in this context, meaningful. The blood god was not a being constrained by the membrane between immaterium and materium, the way lesser demons were constrained. He was not subject to summoning circles, ritual requirements, the careful mathematical pleading that mortals used to drag entities across the boundary. He was constrained by something more fundamental and more absolute. The fact that the material universe, as presently constituted, could not contain what he was without consequences. That would render the question of containment academic. A full manifestation of Korn in real space was not a military event. It was a geological one, a cosmological one. It was the kind of event the chaos gods did. Not an act because the galaxy they wanted to consume was more useful, intact than converted to a scream. Partial manifestation was different. An avatar, a concentrated projection of divine will, compressed to the scale the material universe could sustain without immediate structural failure, wearing the shape of the blood god the way a blade wears an edge. Not Korn entire, Korn sufficient. The difference between the sun and a lens that focuses the sun's light to a point, the point burns. The sun continues. The sky above Cadia Secundus opened at 0347 hours. Not a warp rift. Warp rifts were tears, the membrane pierced by force or ritual, ragged at the edges, bleeding immaterium into real space the way a wound bleeds. This was something else. This was the membrane pressed from the other side by something so vast that the pressing itself was the event, the boundary between real and unreal, bulging downward like the surface of water before a submerged thing breaches it, distorting the sky above the eastern approach into a geometry that the human visual system processed as wrongness. Before the specific nature of the wrongness resolved, stars bent. The air itself changed color. Not the green of Broly's aura or the blue gold of Tsinch's sorcery, but a red that was not a color in the visible spectrum, and should not have been visible, and was anyway. The red of Korn's domain bleeding through the pressed membrane like light, through a fist pressed against a lamp. Every psyker on Cadia Secundus lost consciousness simultaneously. Not fainted, the specific, surgical, involuntary shutdown of a sensory system overwhelmed. Beyond its operating parameters, the psychic equivalent of looking directly at the sun. Astropaths, navigators. The choir master on Terra, 900 light-years away, jerked awake in her chair having fallen asleep since the Emperor's 9-second attention had passed, and felt what was happening above Cadia Secundus through the warp's propagation, with the clarity of someone who has learned to read the ocean by the way it moves. Before the wave arrives, she was on the Vox to Valdris in under 30 seconds. Valdris was already outside. The Avatar came through last, after the tide. The tide came first, a flood of cornate demons on a scale that made the warband Broly had destroyed on arrival look like a patrol. Bloodletters in their thousands. The foot soldiers of the blood god's legions, their hellblades burning, with cornate fire, pouring through the pressed membrane in columns that the air couldn't contain without superheating. Behind them, the flesh hounds, demonic hunters that could track anything by its blood scent across any distance, through any dimension. Their collars of corn marking them as the blood gods, personal instruments of pursuit. Behind them, things with no name in imperial records, entities from the deeper reaches of Korn's domain that had never before been sent to the material universe because the material universe had never before required them, because there had never before been a reason to send them, all of it oriented on one point: the crater. Gilliman was on his feet before the first bloodletter reached the perimeter, the Emperor's sword in his hand and the hand of Dominion, power fist crackling at his side, and his voice on every Vox frequency simultaneously, the Primarch's voice, engineered to carry command at scales that made conventional amplification redundant. All Imperial forces advance and engage. Priority is holding the outer perimeter. Nothing reaches the center. Nothing. The honor guard came off the crater rim. Sicarius's combat squad was moving from the wall staging point. The Astra Militarum on the walls were already firing las guns and heavy bolters and autocannons, opening up against a tide that las guns and heavy bolters and autocannons were not, in any honest assessment, sized for. But they fired because that was what they were and what they did. Because 10,000 years of Cadian blood had produced soldiers who fired, regardless of honest assessments of sizing. Because the wall was the wall, and you held it. The orcs hit the bloodletter column from the flank with the kind of enthusiastic violence that didn't require orders or strategy or any cognitive processing beyond the perception of a fight and the desire to be in it. Grimtusk went through the leading bloodletters like a geological event passing through a forest, his power claw and his shoulda and his 6 meters of mega-armored orc constituting a physics argument that even cornate demons had to engage with. Around him, his knobs did what knobs did, followed their war boss into the worst of it with the conviction that proximity to greatness was its own form of armor. It wasn't, but it was sufficient for long enough. Broly stood in the crater and watched the sky. The tide was wrong. Wrong in the same way this place was wrong. Saturated with that pressure below noise that he had been learning since arrival. But the tide was the pressure made physical. The wrongness given bodies and blades and the specific directional quality of toward him. He understood directed. He understood bodies moving with purpose toward him. He had understood that on Vampa before he had understood almost anything else. He also understood that the large armored things were in the tide's path. This was a newer understanding, the distinction between things in the path that were threats and things in the path that were not. Valdris, who had given food and sat at the perimeter with patience. Sicarius, who had come into the crater. Gilliman, who had sat down and said his name back to him with imperfect pronunciation and genuine care. The creatures on the wall who fired their small bright weapons at things that were much larger than them without stopping. He had learned, slowly and with difficulty and the particular effort of someone, building a practice against their own nature. The difference between things he didn't like and things that needed to be destroyed. He had not learned the distinction between things in danger and things that would handle their own danger. That distinction was newer, half-formed, built in the last 18 hours by observation of creatures that were not afraid to stand in front of things larger than them. He watched Gilliman's powered fist dismantle 3 bloodletters in 2 seconds. Watched the pre-march move through the leading edge of the tide with the terrifying efficiency of something that had been built for exactly this. 3 meters of engineered humanity, holding a line against a flood of demons with the absolute commitment of someone who had decided this line was worth holding before he arrived and had not yet found a reason to revise the decision. Broly's aura came up, not the fraction, not the careful, deliberate portion that practice and effort had taught him to maintain as a default. He let it come up to where it wanted to be. Not the white core output of the Scarbrand engagement, not yet, but the furnace level, the working level, the level that expressed something true about what he was, rather than the measured diplomatic understatement of what he'd been presenting since arrival. He stepped out of the crater. The bloodletted tide that hit him parted. Not strategically, not with the tactical awareness that would have required the capacity for tactical awareness, which bloodletters possessed approximately the way stones possessed swimming technique. They parted the way a River parts around a rock that is too large to redirect. Contact made. Contact found insufficient. The flow continuing around the obstacle because continuity of flow was the only response available. He went through the tide, toward the outer perimeter, and the tide came apart around him in pieces, and the pieces stopped existing as functional demons at a rate that the Astra Militarum troops on the wall watched with the specific quality of attention you give to something so far outside your calibration that your mind files it under witness rather than comprehend. He reached Gilliman's position in the outer press, where the pre-march and the honor guard and Sicarius's squad were holding a hard line against the heavier elements of the tide, the flesh hounds, and the deeper domain things that the records had no names for. And the difference his presence made in the line was immediate and structural. Not because he was coordinating. He had no language for tactical coordination, and the concept of coordinated line defense was not yet in his understanding's vocabulary, because the space around him was a different kind of space, the space that existed around something that the tide could not effectively process, and the line held differently where that space was present. Gilliman fought beside him for 40 seconds before the Avatar arrived, 40 seconds in which the pre-march assessed, with the multivariable cognition his father had designed specifically for moments like this, what it was like to fight beside Broly. The assessment was not tactical, the tactics were straightforward: hold the line, destroy what reached the line, maintain the perimeter until the tide could be managed. The assessment was about something the reports hadn't captured, and the data hadn't conveyed, and even the pickcaster footage had failed to communicate, because footage showed what happened, but not what it felt like to be adjacent to it. It felt like standing next to a principle, not a person, a principle made physical, something the universe had decided to express in biological form because the universe occasionally worked that way, made something that embodied a truth and sent it out into the world to demonstrate the truth by being it. Gilliman had felt this once before, briefly, at the Golden Throne, standing in the presence of a will so vast that its physical form had become irrelevant to its actual nature. The scale was different. Broly was not the Emperor. The comparison was not that comparison. The similarity was structural rather than specific. But the quality was recognizable, something that had decided what it was and was fully that thing, without remainder, without the compromise that consciousness usually made with itself to accommodate the gap between what it was and what it wished it was. Then the Avatar arrived, and there was no more time for assessment. It came through the membrane's lowest point, the place the pressing had thinned the boundary to translucency, and when it came through, the boundary snapped back behind it with a sound that was not a sound but registered in every inner ear on the continent as a single percussive event, like the universe clearing its throat. The Avatar of Korn stood 90 meters tall. This was not Korn. Gilliman was precise about this in his own cognition, even as he registered the sight and the aspects, data, and the full system warp alarm screaming its highest classification. This was a projection, an instrument. The difference between the blood god and this Avatar was the difference between the ocean and a tidal wave. The wave was drawn from the ocean, moved with the ocean's power, crashed with the ocean's force, and was not the ocean. But standing on the shore when the wave arrived, the distinction was primarily philosophical. It looked at the crater, at the green light around the figure that stood in the tide's parted wake. The Avatar of the blood god looked at the thing that had not fed him and whose kills had not reached his throne. And the Avatar's expression, if the word expression could be applied to something that had no face in the human sense but communicated nonetheless with total clarity, was not the vast indifference of cosmic evil toward mortal significance. It was the opposite of indifference. It was attention, total, focused, absolute attention. The blood god's attention on the thing that his greatest bloodthirster had failed to break, that his devoted Thousand Sons allies had failed to bind, that had been sitting in his theater of war for 18 hours refusing to be consumed or converted, or even properly categorized. The Avatar spoke one word in the language of Korn's domain, a language that was not really a language in the sense of communication between separate minds, but a direct imposition of divine will onto the physics of the material universe. felt in every cell of every living body. Within 3 kilometers is a vibration that bypassed hearing and registered. Somewhere more fundamental. The word was a name, not Broly's name. The blood god did not know Broly's name, had no mechanism for learning it, operated in a vocabulary that contained approximately one noun, and that noun was skull. The name it spoke was the name of what? Broly was in Korn's taxonomy, the word for unkillable thing, the word for greatest skull, the word that in the blood gods' cosmology represented the highest category of existence available to a material being, the word that meant mine. Broly looked at the avatar. The aura went white. Not gradually, not the incremental climb of the Scarbrand. Engagement, the ceiling found. Over 4 minutes of sustained exchange. This was instantaneous and total. The suppression released not as a response to incoming force, but as a statement of intent. The full expression of what he was without the practice of restraint, holding any portion of it in reserve. The temperature in a 500-meter radius climbed 60 degrees in under 3 seconds. The orcs at the outer perimeter were knocked from their feet by the thermal wave. Gilliman's armor registered surface temperature. Alerts across its full external coverage. The Astra Militarum troops on the wall above covered their eyes. The green light was not green anymore. It was white at the core and green at the edges, and the white was the color of something, for which white was simply the closest word available in the visible spectrum's vocabulary. The crater behind him glowed. The rock beneath his feet was liquid at the contact points of his footprints. He looked at the avatar of Korn. He was not afraid of it. He had not been afraid of the warband, or of Scarbrand, or of the sorcerer's threads reaching into the deep places. Fear was not a response he had been built for, not by Scion genetics and not by Vampa's conditions and not by anything in his experience that had trained him toward it. He looked at the avatar with the same quality of attention he gave to everything. Total, present, unmediated. And something in him recognized what the avatar had said. Not the language. Not the specific content of the blood god's declaration. Something beneath the language. The intent behind the word. The claim embedded in it. The fundamental assertion that he was a category. A thing that belonged to something else. He had heard this before. Not in words. In actions. In the way people looked at him on his world, in the weight of a father's voice across years of isolation, in the specific quality of being regarded as an instrument rather than a person, a power rather than a self. He had heard this before, and he had learned, slowly and with enormous difficulty, and the help of someone patient, enough to stay through the difficulty, that the hearing of it did not make it true. He moved. The distance between the outer perimeter and the avatar's position, 300 meters. Through the remaining press of the demonic tide, he covered in a time that the Auspex recorded and that Valdris's analysts would later convert to a velocity that the notation system flagged as requiring verification because the number seemed wrong. It was not wrong. It was simply in a register the notation system had not previously needed to address. He hit the avatar at the avatar's knee, 90 meters up, which meant hitting something the size of a fortress wall with the specific intention of affecting its structural stability and the ground for 2 kilometers in every direction, either cracked or ceased to be ground in the conventional sense. The avatar staggered. 90 meters of the blood god's focused projection, sustained by divine will and warp force and the concentrated faith of 10,000 years of slaughter, staggered, not fell, staggered, and found, in the place where its demonic certainty expected either conquest or the satisfying resistance of something that fought back and thereby honored the blood god's domain, something it was constitutionally unprepared to process. Indifference. Not the indifference of weakness, not the absence of engagement. The indifference of something that was not interested in what the avatar represented, that did not want the fight as tribute or acknowledgement or relationship, that fought because the alternative was letting something that had declared ownership of him do so unopposed. And that was not something he was willing to allow. And the not allowing was not rage in the sense the blood god fed on. It was refusal. Quiet, absolute, personal refusal. The avatar of Korn reached for him with a hand the size of a hab block. He caught the hand. For a moment the Auspex captured, and that the analysts would run and rerun for the rest of their careers. Two things existed in perfect contest in the air above Cadia Secundus, the focused projection of the blood god of chaos, fed by 10,000 years of war and slaughter, and the psychic excess of billions of deaths, and a scion who had been born wrong and raised alone and had found, despite everything, something worth protecting. The moment held. Then Broly pulled downward with both hands and put the avatar of Korn into the ground of Cadia Secundus with a force that the seismic network classified in the stunned and inadequate language of instruments doing their best with events outside their design parameters. As impact event, extreme, source anomalous. Recommend immediate review of classification categories. The avatar hit the ground and the ground disagreed with the impact so profoundly that the disagreement propagated outward as a shockwave that knocked every standing thing in a kilometer flat, and that the warp felt as a psychic detonation. And every psyker who had been unconscious since the membrane pressing snapped awake simultaneously, with no memory of how they'd lost consciousness, and no immediate capacity to process what had happened. The demonic tide stopped. Not routed, not destroyed. Stopped, the way an army stops when its general falls. Not from tactical calculation, but from the severing of the directional. Well, that had been providing momentum. Bloodletters stood in the ruins of the outer perimeter, and cornate flesh hounds halted mid-stride, and the nameless things from Korn's deeper domain simply ceased their forward press, and the pause was absolute and strange and full of the particular silence that follows something that has no precedent. The avatar was not destroyed. Avatars of chaos gods could not be destroyed. In the material universe, their warp substance simply returned to the immaterium when the material form was rendered non-functional. The projection interrupted rather than ended. It dissolved, the 90 meters of focused divine while losing coherence from the impact point outward, returning to the red that was not a color, and then to nothing visible. The membrane above snapping back to normal with a sound that this time everyone heard correctly as sound. A concussive crack like the universe closing a door. The tide, without the avatar's sustaining will behind it, began to dissolve too. Bloodletters flickered and faded, their warp substance thinning below the critical threshold that maintained their material presence. Flesh hounds collapsed into scraps of immaterial energy. The nameless things went first, their tenuous materiality the most dependent on divine sponsorship. In under 3 minutes, the tide was gone. The eastern approach of High Vortigern was quiet in the specific, exhausted way that battlefields go quiet. Not the absence of sound, but the cessation of the kind of sound that had been present, the particular acoustic signature of war-giving way to the acoustic signature of aftermath. Fire and settling debris and the distant sound of the orc camp reassembling itself. Because orcs were pragmatic about reconstruction in the specific sense that they always assumed there would be more fighting and built accordingly. Gilliman stood at the perimeter's edge and looked at the figure standing where the avatar had been. The white was fading from the aura's core, green returning. Then the deliberate reduction of the green. The practiced descent back toward the fraction that had become familiar. The footprints in the ground around Broly glowed orange at their edges and cooled slowly through red toward the dull amber of rock that has been asked to handle more than rock is designed for. Valdris arrived beside the pre-march from the command post at a pace that she did not characterize as running because Inquisitor Lords did not run, and she was maintaining this position even in circumstances that made it linguistically imprecise. Her instruments were doing things she was going to have to spend considerable time explaining. Her face was doing nothing, because 40 years of inquisitorial service had taught her face to default to professional neutrality in circumstances where other expressions would be both accurate and unhelpful. He put a partial corn avatar into the ground, she said. He did, Gilliman agreed. A pause. The aura came down another stage. The footprints cooled to dark. The demonic incursion is resolved, Valdris said. The chaos ground forces are destroyed or withdrawn. The orcs are. She checked her instruments. The orcs appear to be celebrating, which is consistent with what they consider to have occurred. What do they consider to have occurred? The best fight they've ever seen. She looked at Broly, who was standing in the aftermath stillness with the quality she'd been observing. Since arrival, the fullness of the stillness. Not empty, but cataloging. Learning the rules of a new place one event at a time. The chaos incursion on this world is functionally over. The remaining chaos forces on the northern and western approaches have been without coordination since the Avatar's dissolution. The Urkwyak will finish them by morning, after which Grimtusk will presumably redirect his attention toward us, which is a different problem for a different day. A problem we have more resources to address, Gilliman said, than we had 18 hours ago. He started walking toward the crater's center. Valdris fell into step beside him, not asking permission and not needing to. She had authorized exterminatus 7 times and had never yet been told she couldn't walk somewhere. She decided to walk. Broly watched them come. Both of them. The large armored one who had sat and said his name back to him with care, and the small one who had offered food and presents and the patience of someone who understood that understanding took the time it took. He watched them cross the ground between them, and he did not move away, did not raise the aura, did not do any of the things that the part of him that defaulted to distance was suggesting. He waited. Gilliman stopped 3 meters from him, closer than before, not the 10 meters of initial contact, but close enough that the green light of the banked aura was warm on his armor's surface. He looked at Broly, and Broly looked at him, and the exchange contained more than language could have conveyed anyway. The specific grammar of 2 things that had stood beside each other in something and were now standing in the aftermath of it and finding the afterwards different from the before. The pre-march reached into his armor again. Not fruit this time. He held out something else, a small thing. A physical object, the kind of object whose meaning required context and whose context he was about to attempt to convey without any shared language. A Vox bead, one of the Honor Guard's standard issue. A communication device. He held it out in his open palm. Then he pointed at himself. Gilliman. Then at Broly. Then at the Vox bead. Then, and this was the part that required the most complicated mime work that the Lord Commander of the Imperium had ever performed. He mimed a gesture he'd been constructing during the fight. The physical shorthand for I will find you when I need you, and you will be able to find me. He repeated it twice. Broly looked at the Vox bead in the open palm, looked at the mime, reached out, and took the Vox bead, held it in his own palm, an object tiny in his hand, almost invisible, requiring the specific care of something that could be damaged by any unintentional pressure from fingers that had just helped put a chaos God's avatar into the ground. He held it with the focused delicacy of someone who had learned to hold small things carefully because learning that had required practice, and the practice had mattered. He put it against his chest, not as a gesture of acceptance, as a practical decision. Keeping it somewhere in the immaterium. Korn sat on his throne above the ocean of skulls that had been insufficient for one day on one world to add one specific skull to their number, and the blood god's gauntlet on the throne's arm was tighter than it had been in 10,000 years, and the brass of the throne's arm was bending slowly under the grip, and no demon in the entirety of his domain said anything because the particular quality of silence that had descended in Korn's realm was the kind of silence you maintained when something vast was deciding what to feel about something it had not expected to feel. The skull that was not taken. The skull that refused to be taken. In the blood god's taxonomy, that was a category. It had a name. The name did not translate into mortal language cleanly, but its closest approximation was something between enemy and worthy and inevitable, the specific classification reserved for things that Korn had not finished with, that were not yet resolved, that required returning to, not abandoned, return to. The demonic tide would come again, perhaps not above Cadia Secundus, perhaps not tomorrow or the next day or the next year, but the blood god's attention, once fixed, was fixed with the permanence of something that did not forget and did not tire, and was not subject to the attrition that mortal patience was subject to, above the eastern approach of high Vortigern, in the cooling aftermath of a battle that had resolved an incursion that had been called manageable for 9 days and had demonstrably not been. The green fire banked to its lowest and steadiest level, and Broly stood in the quiet with a Vox bead held carefully against his chest, and the Lord Commander of the Imperium standing 3 meters away. And it was not peace. This universe did not produce peace, had not produced peace in 10,000 years, was not structured to produce it, but it was something. It was a day that had been fought and had not been lost. It was enough, for now, to be that. 3 days after the Battle of Vortigern's eastern approach, which was what the Munitorum had formally named it, because the Munitorum named everything in the naming was how the Imperium processed events too large for any other kind of processing. The war councils of 5 separate factions were conducting simultaneous assessments of what had occurred and what it meant. The Astra Militarum's after-action report ran to 400 pages and concluded with the careful hedging of an institution that had learned over millennia to document the unprecedented without committing to positions about it, that the entity designated anomalous contact Sigma 1 had been operationally significant in the resolution of the coordinate incursion. The word significant was doing considerable work in that sentence, and everyone who read it understood this and accepted it as the appropriate level of precision given available vocabulary. The Adeptus Mechanicus filed a separate report that was mostly notation and very little prose, because the Mechanicus expressed things numerically when possible, and the numbers in this report required 3 separate appendices of explanatory framework before they were legible even to other Mechanicus scholars. The report's conclusion, translated from technical notation into something approaching human language, was, the energy output readings are accurate, and we do not know what they mean, and this troubles us considerably. The Ordo Malleus filed nothing yet. Valdris was still writing. She had been writing for 3 days. She had 17 drafts, and none of them said what she needed them to say, which was the specific frustration of someone who had spent 40 years developing precise language for imprecise horrors, and had now encountered something that her precision could not capture. She kept returning to the same problem. Every framework she had for understanding power in the 41st millennium was built on the assumption that power came from somewhere the warp could feel. The warp felt everything. The warp was the substrate of all psychic existence, and psychic existence was the substrate of all meaningful power at the scale she worked at. A thing that drew from outside that substrate had no framework. She would have to build the framework first and write the report second, and the framework was going to take longer than 3 days. The orcs filed nothing, because orcs did not file reports. What they did was talk, constantly, loudly, and with the reenactive enthusiasm of a species that processed history through oral tradition and considered embellishment not a distortion of truth, but an improvement of it. By the 3rd day, the story of the Eastern approach had grown to include details that the Pickcaster footage definitively did not support, and by the end of the week, it would achieve the status of myth, the kind of story that WAC-S repeated to each other across star systems, that weird boys incorporated into their incoherent revelations, that war bosses referenced when they needed to describe the upper boundary of what a fight could be, like the green of her thing, they would say, as a unit of measurement, as a standard. Grimtusk himself had said nothing since the Avatar's dissolution. He was thinking. This was visible to his knobs as a physical state, the stillness of a war boss who was processing something rather than acting on it, which in an orc was as distinctive as a held breath in a human. He had the specific quality of something that had encountered a category it hadn't known existed and was reorganizing its understanding of categories accordingly. He would decide what that meant when he'd finished reorganizing. The knobs waited. Gilliman spent the 3 days in the command post that Valdris had established, working in parallel the logistics of the Indomitus Crusades. 43rd Wave deployment, managed remotely through the Macridge's Honors Communications Array, and the immediate situation of Cadia Secundus, managed through the direct and personal attention of the Lord Commander, present on the ground, which was not how the Lord Commander's time was supposed to be allocated, but which Gilliman had decided was the correct allocation regardless. The immediate situation was this. The chaos incursion was over. The orcs were technically still present and technically still a threat, but the orc WAC had spent 3 days fighting chaos. remnants on the northern and western approaches, with the purposeful enthusiasm of something that had found its preferred activity and was disinclined to stop, and the net effect on the imperial position was favorable enough that declaring them an immediate threat required ignoring large amounts of evidence. Grimtusk's interest was oriented outward, toward the remaining Chaos forces, and would remain so until either those forces were exhausted or something more interesting presented itself. Broly had not left the eastern approach. He had not left because he had nowhere to go, which was the simple reason, but also because he had found something in the compound of Valdris's command post that he was. Gilliman observed this carefully over 3 days and arrived at the word with some confidence. Comfortable with. Not comfortable in the sense of ease. Comfortable in the sense of a thing that had been in conditions of extreme discomfort for long enough that the presence of consistent non-hostility had become its own kind of anchor. He sat at the command post's perimeter the way he had sat in the crater, not performing patience, not waiting for something specific, just present in the place where the things he had found legible were located. Valdris had continued the communication work, systematically, with the methodical intelligence of someone who had spent 40 years building, understanding across species and context gaps that would have defeated less determined minds. She had no shared language and no translation protocols that worked for his particular language. But she had gesture and repetition and time. And she had begun, not translating. Exactly, not yet. Building the foundation on which translation could eventually be constructed. A vocabulary of objects. Chair, food, water, wall, sky, door. The pointing and naming and patient. Waiting for the naming to locate itself in his understanding. And then the evidence of understanding arriving not as words, but as the specific quality of attention he gave to things he had cataloged, recognition, filing. He was fast, faster than any species the Ordo Xenos had acquisition data on, which was all species they had ever encountered that were still alive to be studied. Not fast in learning the sounds of the words, fast in building the structural framework that words attach to. The architecture of things have names, and names have consistent relationships to things that some species took generations to interface with, and that he appeared to be constructing in real time with the efficiency of something that learned through exposure, the way some biological systems learn, by doing it until it was done. By the end of the first day, he had 40 words. By the end of the second, over 200, with grammar, emerging not from instruction, but from pattern recognition, the same cognitive process that had let him read the Scarbrand engagements, physics in real time and respond, before the response was consciously formed.
By the end of the third day, he had enough to make the specific, kind of imprecise,
ambiguous, good faith attempt at communication that Gilliman had been waiting for. Gilliman was reviewing the logistics documents when Broly sat down across the camp table from him. Not at the table. The table was not scaled for him, and the chair was not scaled for him. So he sat on the ground with his arms resting across the table's surface, which put him approximately at eye level with a seated pre-march, which Gilliman suspected was not accidental. He had been watching, learning the spatial grammar of conversation. That eye level was the level of engagement. That below eye level was submission. That above was dominance, and that across was equal, Broly said. Gilliman looked up from the documents. Set them down. Equal, he agreed. A pause. The processing pause. Gilliman had learned to read it over 3 days. The specific duration between receiving language and constructing response, which was longer than a fluent speaker's pause and shorter than a learner's confusion. Something in between. The pause of someone translating not just words, but the weight behind them. This place, Broly said. Not a question. Not a complete sentence. The grammar wasn't there yet. The connective tissue of full sentences still being assembled. A gesture that accompanied the words indicated the scope of this place. Not the command post, not Cadia Secundus. The gesture that swept upward and outward towards sky and implication. Yes, Gilliman said. Another processing pause. Something moved in Broly's face. Not the vast volcanic expression of the Scarbrand fight. Not the stillness of the crater's patience. Something between. Something quieter and more complicated that lived in the register of things felt rather than things done. Wrong, he said. Not accusatory. Factual. The assessment of someone who had been cataloging the rules of a new place and had arrived at a conclusion that the place itself bore responsibility for. Gilliman looked at him for a long moment, thought about what he was being asked, whether the word wrong was the word being used or the closest available word for something that had no precise equivalent yet in his 200-word vocabulary. Thought about what an honest answer looked like. Yes, he said, it is wrong. It has been wrong for a very long time. He paused. We are trying to fix it. The processing pause was the longest yet. The green aura around Broly was banked to its lowest, barely visible in daylight. A shimmer at the edges of his presence rather than a light source. The Vox bead was still against his chest, held there by some mechanism of the clothing he wore, in the place he had put it 3 days ago and had not moved. I will help, Broly said. Not offered, not requested. Stated, the statement of someone who had made a decision using the vocabulary available and was reporting the decision as fact. The same quality of statement that Gilliman made when he looked at the Imperium state and chose to try anyway. The quality of something that had found its position relative to a situation and was committed to it without requiring the situation to deserve the commitment. Gilliman looked at the figure across the camp table and felt the specific weight of moments that were also events, things that happened in places and times but whose significance exceeded the place and time and belonged to something larger. He had felt this before, standing before the Golden Throne, reading the news of Cadia's fall, the first time he had held the Codex Astartes and understood what he was making. He had not expected to feel it sitting across a camp table from a scion with 200 words and a Vox bead held against his chest. Thank you, he said. The questions that the 3 days had not answered were not small questions. What the rift was, where it had come from, whether it could be reopened or closed or reproduced, what its cosmological mechanism was in a universe where warp rifts were understood, and this was not a warp rift. Valdris had 12 theories and confidence in none of them and intended to have confidence in one of them before the year was out, which was an optimistic timeline that she maintained anyway because pessimistic timelines invited the kind of abandonment of inquiry that she found professionally intolerable. What the Chaos Gods would do next. Korn's avatar had been grounded, and the Blood God's interest had not diminished. It had intensified, in the way that the interest of something that had never been denied intensifies when it encounters denial. The next engagement would not be a probing send of Scarbrand or a tactical trial by rubric Marines. The next engagement would be planned, with the full weight of a god's attention, on the specific problem of how to bring something that could not be claimed by force to the condition of being claimed. Cinch's threads were already rebuilding. Valdris could feel the warp's texture above Cadia Secundus shifting, the subtle wrongness of a plan being rewoven from a failed draft toward a new architecture. Nurgle and Slaanesh had not yet moved visibly. They would. The quiet thing Cinch's sorcerer had found in the emotional probe, the small, carefully maintained thing beneath. The grief and rage was the kind of vulnerability that the Changer of Ways and the Dark Prince of Excess both found interesting, in different ways, and neither of them had been heard from yet. What Broly was. Not tactically. Gilliman had enough tactical assessment to work with. What he was in the larger sense, where his power came from, how it grew, what its ceiling was, whether the ceiling existed in any form the 41st millennium's physics could engage with. The Auspex data from the Avatar engagement had produced numbers that the Mechanicus report had required 3 appendices to contextualize, and that Valdris's instruments had registered in notations she was still developing vocabulary for. The Scarbrand engagement had shown a ceiling rising. The Avatar engagement had shown something that might not be a ceiling at all, but a floor, a base level beneath which the output had never gone and above which it had gone further than any engagement prior. The question of what further looked like, pushed by the 41st millennium's full weight of ancient evil, was a question that Valdris was honest enough with herself to acknowledge she was not entirely certain. She wanted the answer to, and what it meant for the Imperium, not strategically, not the logistics, of another asset in the Crusades' order of battle. The deeper meaning, the one that lived in the philosophical register that 10,000 years of darkness had almost entirely foreclosed on. Something existed that the warp could not touch, that the chaos gods could not consume or corrupt or claim, that drew from a power source so fundamental and so old that it predated the warp's current catastrophic dominance of the galaxy's metaphysics, something that had been present in the universe before the chaos gods had grown to their current scale, and that still operated by the older rules, the pre-warp rules, the rules of a universe that had not yet been eaten from the inside by the emotional excess of intelligent species who had learned to feel things without learning to manage what their feelings created. The Emperor on the Golden Throne had recognized it. That fact lived in Gilliman's cognition with the particular weight of things that couldn't be unfelt. His father had recognized something, had reached through 10,000 years of functional postcognition toward a signal that had arrived from the direction of an impossible rift above a contested hive world and had found, for 9 seconds, something that resonated with what he had been before the throne, before the 10,000 years, before the heresy and the long war and the slow, terrible erosion of a mind, maintained past its biological context by the sheer force of necessity, before, when he had been something else, something that worked by different rules, perhaps, something older. Gilliman did not know what to do with that. He filed it in the place where he filed things that were true and important and not yet ready to be used, a place that had grown considerably in the 800 years since his resurrection, because the galaxy had proven to contain many true and important things that defied readiness. He filed it and returned to what was ready, the logistics, the deployments, the Indomitus Crusade's 43rd wave, and the figure sitting at the command post perimeter with a vox bead against his chest and 200 words, and the willingness, stated as fact rather than offer, to help. On the 4th morning, Grimtusk came, not with his warband, alone, or as alone as a war boss ever came anywhere, which meant with 2 knobs at a distance that they considered unobtrusive, and that was not unobtrusive at all. He came to the command post's outer edge and stopped and looked at Broly, and Broly looked at him, and the look between them contained the vocabulary of the fight they had had, which was a vocabulary that required no translation. Grimtusk said something in Orc. Valdris had her linguist present, the Mechanicus specialist, who had the expression of a man being asked to translate between 2 categories of the extreme. He says, the linguist said, slowly, that he is leaving. His warband is finished here. The good fight is finished. A pause. He says the green of her thing. A longer pause. He says you fight good. He says the thing you did to the big red thing. The linguist appeared to be struggling with the specific register of Orc approval. He says it was proper. That's the closest translation is correct, or right, or exactly as it should be. It's a high compliment in Orc. Broly looked at Grimtusk. Then he said the word, imperfect. The vowel's wrong for an Orc throat, but recognizable. The linguist blinked. He just said proper. The linguist said, unnecessarily, since everyone present had heard it. Grimtusk looked at Broly for a long moment with his
one eye in his modified scope,
and his expression that was doing the specific work of an Orc experiencing an emotion its neurology did not have a designated pathway for. Then he raised his power claw, the gesture from the first day, the raised weapon that was not a weapon, the Orc grammar of respect expressed through the promise of effort. Broly raised his hand, open palm, the gesture Sicarius had taught him on the first day, adapted, not the human grammar of I am not attacking you but something between that and Grimtusk's raised claw, something that managed to be both at once. The war boss turned and walked back toward his warband, stopped once without turning, said something. He says, the linguist translated, with the exhaustion of someone who had been doing this for 4 days and was beginning to feel that their career had been preparation for a specific test they had not known was coming. To save him a good fight, Grimtusk's whack left Cadian airspace by midday, the Red Fleet burning toward whatever next presented itself as interesting. The system's void was quiet for the first time in 11 days. The remains of the chaos incursion on the northern and western approaches were being processed by the Astra Militarum with the methodical efficiency of soldiers. cleaning up after something that was already decided. The eastern approach was clear. Cadia Secundus breathed. Gilliman departed on the 5th day, not because the situation required it. The situation was stable. The crisis resolved. The strategic calculus of remaining versus departing was ambiguous enough that either could have been justified. He departed because the Indomitus Crusades 43rd wave required decisions that could not be made remotely, and because Valdris had made it clear that she was fully capable of managing the ongoing contact without Primarch-level oversight, and because he understood, with the Primarch as particular cognition for the weight of symbols, that his departure was itself a statement, that he trusted the situation to continue in his absence, that he trusted Broly's stated intention without the reassurance of supervision. He stood at the Thunderhawks boarding ramp and looked across the command posts compound to where Broly sat at the perimeter with the morning light doing something complicated with his aura, the green picking up the angle of illumination from a star whose light was already filtered through the residue of 11 days of war, creating a quality of light that had no name in any palette he knew. Broly was watching something, not the Thunderhawk, something past the perimeter, in the direction of the hive, where the people were, where the 40 billion souls of a hive world lived their compressed and desperate lives in the stacked layers of a civilization that had been surviving this long through the sheer bloody-mindedness of refusing to stop. He was watching in the way he watched everything, total, present, unmediated. But there was something in the specific quality of his attention toward this particular object that Gilliman filed in the same place as his father's 9 seconds and the small, carefully maintained thing beneath, the grief and rage, something that had found in this wrong place full of wrong-feeling sky and warp pressure and ancient evil, something worth watching, not a threat, not a target, just people living their lives in the shadow of a war that had been happening since before they were born, in conditions that would have collapsed most civilizations, with the particular resilience of things that had never known anything different, and had therefore never stopped to measure themselves against a better alternative. Gilliman raised his hand, open palm. Broly turned, saw it, raised his own. The pre-march boarded the Thunderhawk. The ramp closed. The ship lifted with the precise economy of Astartes' pilot craft, banking toward orbit without the drama of a vessel, asserting its relationship with gravity, simply departing because departure was the next thing. Broly watched it go. The weeks that followed were Valdris's. She spent them in the patient, systematic work of building language between two things that had no shared one, and she was good at it. Not because the Inquisition had trained her for this specific task, which it had not, but because 40 years of facing things that wanted to destroy the Imperium had developed in her a particular relationship with understanding, not just defeating things, understanding them. The conviction that a thing understood was a problem shaped, if not solved, and that shaped problems were categorically different from unsolved ones regardless of whether the shaping was sufficient. Broly learned. He learned fast, and he retained completely, and he generalized accurately. Given a rule's application in one context, he found its application in adjacent contexts without requiring instruction, which was the specific cognitive signature of a mind that processed pattern rather than instance. By the end of the first week, he had 500 words in the grammar to build more words from their components. By the end of the second, he was asking questions, not the simple object identification, questions of early vocabulary, but structural questions about the place and its rules, asked in the imprecise but earnest language of someone who had decided that understanding the place was necessary and was applying effort to necessity. He asked about the warp. She answered as honestly as she could, which was to say, she answered with what the Imperium understood about the warp, which was both extensive and deeply incomplete. He listened with the specific quality of attention he gave to things he was mapping, cataloging not just the information, but the shape of the gaps in the information, the places where her answers became uncertain or her language became hedged, filing the uncertainty as data alongside the certainty. He asked about the God Emperor. She was quiet for a long time before answering that one. She told him what she knew, what the Imperium understood, what faith maintained, what the evidence suggested, what the theology said. She told him about the golden throne and the daily sacrifice, and the astronomicon and what the absence of those things would mean for the 100 billion souls navigating the warp toward ports that would receive them, or the 100 billion who wouldn't make it, and what that meant for the ones they were navigating toward. She told him what 10,000 years of sustained divine will look like from the outside, which was the imperium of mankind, vast and brutal and desperately imperfect, and still here, still here, still here, which was not nothing, which was in fact the most significant fact in the galaxy. He listened to all of it. Then he was quiet for the processing duration, longer than usual, long enough that she almost asked if he wanted her to stop. Then he said, with the careful precision of someone choosing words from a still small vocabulary for a thought that required more words than he had, "He is still there, still trying." He touched the vox bead against his chest. Like Gilliman, trying. Valdris looked at him, at the green fire at its lowest, the practiced, careful fraction, the stillness full rather than empty, at a thing that had been born wrong and raised alone, and had come through a rift from somewhere into a universe that ran on suffering and had found, in 18 hours, things worth protecting, and had said, "I will help," as a statement of fact. "Yes," she said. Exactly like that. The system was quiet the night Valdris filed her 17th draft and decided it was the one she would send. Quiet in the relative sense. Cadia Secundus was never fully quiet. The eye bled color at the horizon every night, and the PDF's watches ran continuous, and the Mechanicus monitoring stations ticked and calculated, and the astropathic relay handled traffic. That never slowed because the Imperium's need for communication never slowed. But the particular quality of noise that war added was absent. The 11 days of incursion were 11 days behind them, and the noise of the aftermath had settled into the noise of normal operation, which was its own kind of statement. Broly sat at the command post's perimeter and looked at the eye of terror, the great wound in real space where the warp bled permanently into the material universe, where the chaos gods' domains pressed closest to the galaxy the Imperium was trying to hold together, where the long war had been waged for 10,000 years and would be waged for as long as the chaos gods existed and the Imperium survived. And the two facts remained in opposition. He looked at it with the expression Valdris had learned over 3 weeks to read. Not fear, not the awe that a new thing provokes, but the concentrated attention of something that was mapping, cataloging, learning the rules. He had been doing this since arrival. He would continue doing it. The learning was not finished, would not be finished, perhaps could not be finished, because the rules of this place were deep and strange and built on 10,000 years of accumulated wrong that did not reveal itself quickly, but the practice of learning it had become as natural as breathing, as natural as the banked aura, as natural as the vox bead held against his chest. The eye burned its colors at the horizon. Broly watched it the way you watch something you intend to understand. Far away, in the crystalline, impossible geometry of the planet of sorcerers, Arathon the twice renamed stood before a new configuration of his masters. Threads and read the plan that had been rebuilt. From the failed probe's data, the quiet thing beneath the grief and rage, small and carefully maintained. The thing the probe had touched, for a fraction of a second before the feedback severed the connection. Cinch had found the frequency, had mapped the specific emotional signature of something being protected, rather than felt, held rather than expressed. The kind of thing that living beings built walls around because the walls were the only architecture between it and the conditions that had tried to destroy it. The changer of ways did not attack walls directly. That was Korn's approach, and Korn's approach had produced the result above. Cadia Secundus that it had produced, which was insufficient. Cinch worked through walls by finding the thing on the other side and addressing it directly, by making the thing on the other side feel, at last, that it had been seen, by offering the thing that walls were built to protect the specific experience of no longer needing the wall. The thread was thin. The plan was long. The changer of ways had 10,000 years of practice in long plans, and the patience that came from being a being, for whom time was a medium rather than a constraint. It would wait. It was already beginning. Gilliman's report to the High Lords of Terra ran to 9 pages. for a document of its classification level and subject matter. 9 pages represented remarkable compression, the Lord Commander, writing with the specific economy of someone who had made a decision and was reporting the decision, rather than building toward it. The relevant paragraph, toward the end, read, "The entity designated anomalous contact. Sigma 1 has demonstrated non-hostility, measurable linguistic acquisition, strategic value in the resolution of the Cadian Secundus Coronate incursion, and what I assess as genuine willingness to assist imperial interests. It has further demonstrated power output of a scale and nature that the Adeptus Mechanicus cannot fully quantify, and that the Ordo Malleus cannot categorize by existing framework. It draws from no source the warp can access. It cannot be corrupted by existing chaos mechanisms. It grows stronger when challenged. The chaos gods have taken direct and personal interest in it and have failed, thus far, to claim or destroy it. I recommend it be treated as an ally. I recommend this not because the strategic calculus requires it, though it does. I recommend it because it sat down in a warzone after defeating 800 enemies and waited, with patience, for someone to come and try understanding rather than weapons. It gave us that chance. We should not waste it. The 41st millennium is dark. There is very little in it that draws from somewhere the darkness cannot reach. We should not be casual with what we find of that kind. The High Lords of Terra read the report, discussed it, argued about it with the thoroughness of an institution that had 9,000 years of bureaucratic tradition behind its arguments, filed it at a classification level that the Munitorum would not disturb for a generation. Above Cadia Secundus, the eye burned its permanent wound in the sky. The green fire burned back, not defiantly, without the grammar of defiance, which required an audience and an intention to perform for it. Simply burning, the way things burn when burning is what they are. The way a star burns not to illuminate, but because the illumination is the expression of the star's nature, and the nature is prior to the expression, and will continue when the expression stops being observed. The darkness of the 41st millennium was old and deep, and total, and it had been eating the light for 10,000 years, and it was very good at it, and it was not finished. But it had not expected this particular light, had not expected something that came from outside its vocabulary, that fed from outside its substrate, that grew rather than diminished when the darkness pressed against it with its full and ancient weight. It had not expected Broly. The galaxy was going to have to adjust. In the months that followed, the legends spread the way legends spread in the 41st millennium, not through sanctioned channels, not through the administratum's careful management of permitted narratives, but through the mouths of soldiers who had been on the eastern wall the night of the Avatar's fall, through the Orc oral tradition that was already adding details and scale with every retelling, through the whispered networks of information that the Inquisition ran and was unable to entirely control even in its own house. Something had come through a rift above Cadia Secundus, and it had refused everything the darkness offered, refused Korn's claim, refused Cinch's threads, refused the identity of weapon or instrument or category, refused with the quiet, absolute conviction of something that knew, with hard-won certainty, what it was. The eye of terror continued to burn. Above it, small and green and banked to its careful fraction, the fire that the darkness could not consume, continued to watch and wait, and learn the rules of a wrong place that was, slowly, beginning to feel like somewhere worth fighting for. What came next would test that conviction in ways that Cadia Secundus, for all its fire, had not yet managed. But that was the nature of the 41st millennium. There was always something next. Broly came through a rift that had no name in any imperial record and landed in a universe that ran on 10,000 years of suffering. And he did not become what the suffering wanted him to become. That was the whole story. Everything else, the warband, the war boss, the rubric marines, the blood god's avatar driven into the Cadian rock by hands that had been built for exactly this and had chosen, still, to hold back, was evidence for the story, not the story itself. He sat at the edge of a command post on a contested hive world with a vox bead against his chest and 200 words, growing toward 300, and the eye of terror burned its permanent wound in the sky above him. and the chaos gods rearranged their plans in the patient and terrible way of things that had not finished. And the Lord, commander of the Imperium, had filed a report recommending that he be treated as an ally. The 41st millennium had never contained him before. It was learning what that meant. So was he. In the grim darkness of the far future, something had arrived from somewhere the darkness could not follow. It was only just beginning.